la necesidad de
and
regresar a la
we had the
planeación
need of going
indicativa de
back to
largo plazo
go
para
to
poder crear
long-term planning
inversión.
to be able to create
Y
new
hemos tenido
investments.
varias olas,
And
¿no? Veo
we've
a Cristian
had several
Jaramillo,
waves.
Colombia
I see
definitivamente ha
Cristian
pasado por
Jaramillo,
mucho
where
con
Colombia
el
has
famoso cargo por
done greatly
capacidad.
with its
Y sobre todo, también la llegada
capacities,
de los
and above
renovables
all, the
de gran escala
renewables that
conectados a la
came, the
red
large-scale
de
renewables
transmisión, que
connected
nos
to the
también
transmission
trajo
networks,
un
which
nuevo
also brought new challenges, not only for operators, batteries, and finally, all connecting behind,
del
all
smart meter o
connectivity
del meter,
behind the
¿no?
smart meter.
Behind the meter. Otra vez una revolución en cómo vamos a operar, cómo vamos a regular. Yo le contaba ahorita a Michael Polite la anécdota de que durante la pandemia estaba yo escribiendo un pequeño paper sobre
Small paper on
generación distribuida. Entonces,
distributed
cuando hablaba con los
generation,
diferentes
and
países,
when I
Colombia,
talked to
Brasil,
different
etcétera,
countries,
todos me decían,
Colombia,
pero eso es
Brazil, etc., they would say,
incipiente,
but
eso,
that's something
no, yo
incipient.
hablaba del el mercado del
I
futuro y
was
los
talking
operadores en
about
distribución, todos
future
me decían, no,
markets
eso
of
es
operating distributors, and all
insignificante.
said this is
Bueno,
something
Luis
insignificant.
Barroso va a hablar
Well,
de esto,
Luis
pero 5
Barroso
años
will talk,
después,
but
no estoy muy
5
segura qué
years
está pasando en
later,
otros
we're
países,
not
pero me
sure
imagino
what's
que la
happening with
tendencia es
other
igual.
countries, but I
5
imagine
años
the trend is
después,
the same.
Brasil
5
tiene
years
más de
later,
20
Brazil has
gigavatios,
more than 20
más
gigawatts,
30,
plus 30, more,
40 y tantos
40
gigavatios
something gigawatts
de
of
energía solar arriba
solar
del rooftop,
power,
¿no? Eso es
of
2 veces
rooftop
inferior
solar power.
en
This is
5 años. Es impresionante.
2
Bueno,
times
entonces,
in
¿cómo
5 years
operar y
its
regular estos
original amount. So
mercados?
how to operate and
De
regulate
eso
these
vamos a hablar
markets
hoy.
will
Michael
be talked
Polite
about
nos va a
today,
hablar
and Michael will talk to
sobre
us
la
about
regulación que está
the
pasando
regulations and what's
Estados
happening
Unidos, Europa
in
y
the
Australia,
US, Europe, and
en donde la
Australia,
demanda no crece
where
tan
the
rápido como en
demand
nuestros
doesn't grow
países,
as strongly
economías
as in our
emergentes, donde la
countries,
demanda está
in
creciendo muy
emerging
rápido, pero
economies
creo
where
que también va a
demand
tocar un poco
grows
el
greatly.
tema
But he also will
de
touch upon subjects of China
China y otro país, no me
and
acuerdo cuál,
other
pero
countries. I don't
India, me
remember
parece.
which, India, I
Y
think it
después
seems.
Luis
And
Barroso va a hablar
then Luis
de
Barroso
Brasil.
will follow
Eso es
with Brazil.
interesante. Bueno,
With
los dejo
with
con
this,
el
I
profesor
leave you
Michael
now
Polite de
with
la
Professor
Universidad de Cambridge,
Michael Bridge
hable
so
de
that
sus
he can talk to us
últimas
about his
investigaciones
recent
y el libro que acaba de
research
publicar
and
en este tema.
book published on the
Muchas
subject.
gracias.
Thank you very much.
Okay, hello everyone. Hopefully my slides are going to come up.
Bien, muchas gracias. Espero que mis diapositivas sí aparezcan.
Okay, great.
Excelente.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be
Es
here.
un
Thank
placer
you,
estar aquí.
Gabriela and the team for
Gracias,
inviting
Gabriela, al
me.
equipo por invitarme.
I'm on a bit of a world tour at the
Estoy
moment.
en
In the
un tour
last month or
mundial
so,
por
I've
el
been to
momento, porque en el
China,
último
I've been to
mes
Abu
he
Dhabi and
viajado a
Saudi
China,
Arabia,
Abu
and now I am in
Dhabi,
Chile,
en
which is
Saudi Arabia y
great.
ahora en Chile, lo que es excelente.
And you'll be
Y
pleased to know that people ask about the same
sería
questions
bueno
everywhere,
saber
and
que
that a
todos
lot of
hacen las
the
mismas
problems
preguntas
that
en todo el
people
mundo y
have,
muchos de los
especially with their
problemas que se
electricity
tienen,
systems, are the
especialmente con
same
sus
everywhere.
sistemas eléctricos,
So
son lo
China
mismo.
now
Así que
has
China
some provinces with
tiene
3,000 hours of
provincias
negative
con
prices a
3.000
year.
horas de precios
Due to
negativos por año,
renewables.
por ejemplo, debido a los renovables.
So, you thought
Así
Germany was
que
bad,
uno
but
pensó
China's
que
actually worse.
Alemania estaba mal, pero
Okay,
China
but
está
I'm not
incluso
going to talk
peor.
about
Pero
that
bien, no hablaré de aquel.
at the moment. I'm going to
Por el
talk about
momento hablaré de
this work based
este
on our new
trabajo
book
basado
on
en nuestro último
the
libro,
Handbook of Electricity
un
Regulation,
manual
and I'm
de
going
la
to try and
regulación
summarize the book.
eléctrica,
Now,
tratando de
I won't, if
resumirlo.
anybody was
Si
an
alguien,
author of one of the chapters, please forgive me, because
si
I'm going to summarize what
conoce
I thought was
un
interesting
autor de
about
los
your
libros o fue
chapter,
autor del
not
libro, por favor
what they
perdóneme, no
thought
soy
was
buen
interesting about their chapter.
resumidor.
So I'm going
Así que
to
voy a
just give you a quick
simplemente darles una
overview of
breve
what I think some of
revisión
the
de lo que creo
highlights are. I
que
do
serían algunos
recommend that you
destacables.
look at the
Recomiendo
book in more
que
detail. It
veamos
is
el libro
available
en más
very cheap
detalle,
online,
disponible
so you
muy
can get an
barato
electronic
en línea
copy very
para
cheaply.
una copia digital
I'm going to
baratamente.
talk about the
Yo hablaré
Handbook on
del
Electricity Regulation. There is a
manual
handbook on
de
electricity markets which
regulación
is very
eléctrica.
similar,
También
but
hay otro de
focuses on
mercados eléctricos que es similar, pero
wholesale market
no
arrangements in
es.
electricity, whereas
Estos
this is
son
very much
modelos de
focused
mercado,
on
mientras
the
que el
distribution and
primer libro
transmission
se
regulation.
enfoca en regulación de
The book
distribución
is
y
divided
transmisión.
into
El
a
libro se
number of
divide
parts, which I'll
en
cover.
varias partes que
One is looking
cubriré.
at, the
Uno,
current state of
observando el
regulation
estado actual de la
in
regulación,
particularly advanced countries,
particularmente países
and
más
then
avanzados,
there's
y
a section which is
también una
looking at
sección que observará
the path to a
el
net zero
camino
electricity system,
hacia un sistema
which
eléctrico
we're still
neto
on in Europe,
cero que
just about. Okay, a lot
aún
of
se cree en
pressure to
Europa.
change things, but
No hay presión,
yeah, it's probably
para cambiar cosas, pero probablemente sigue sobreviviendo la idea. Y después hablaré un poco de China, India y países de ingresos bajos y medios, cada uno que tiene su propio capítulo en el libro. Bien, en general, y temas en general, la regulación incentivada funciona. Los mejores sistemas regulatorios usan el incentivo y redes de distribución. Esto es bastante fácil si es que tienen una red de distribución. Algo que recordar, como hay que regular calidad como costo. A veces se olvidan solamente. Si uno solamente implementa calidad de utilidad, el costo. Ahora la regulación de transmisión se hace más difícil. Muchos países tienen dificultad con explosión de costos o potencial aumento de costos e inversiones. Aprendí de Países Bajos recientemente, cuyos países de transmisión de base va en curso para multiplicarse de 5 dentro de 10 años. Así que sistemas antiguos de transmisión comienzan a tener dificultades con agregar mucho capital, donde países avanzados, donde la cantidad de unidades aumenta. Y sea cero neto pueda ser entregado con sistemas actuales regulatorios incentivados, no queda claro cómo podemos adaptar la regulación para incentivar el neto cero. Y esto es algo que muchos sistemas tienen dificultades aún. Y neto cero es un ambicioso objetivo para todo el sistema eléctrico. Sería sorprendente si no se necesitan hacer cambios al por mayor de cómo se organiza el sistema actual eléctrico. Estamos ya comenzando a ver y alejarnos de intentos hacia privatización de sistemas de transmisión, mientras que en Reino Unido recientemente nacionalizamos el operador de sistemas. Y este sería un ejemplo de cómo nuestra institución tuvo que cambiar
target, and the feeling that completely decentralizing it to private companies couldn't do that. Of course, it's important to say that while we can talk about the path to net zero, many countries in the world are struggling even with the basics of incentive-based regulation, and it's important not to gloss over that. And the book is actually pretty clear about that. And if only countries could learn the basics of incentive-based regulation, that would be a major plus for them. Forget about net zero in the meantime. Okay, I'm going to attempt to quickly summarize what each of the chapters is about. We start off talking about the theory. Sappington and Brown have a very nice chapter summarizing incentive regulation. You know, incentive regulation is about trying to harness private and decentralized incentives on the part of companies to do the right thing at least cost with the highest possible quality. And well-designed incentive-based regulation can and does do that. And there are examples of great regulation going on. Of course, Ofgem in Great Britain is a good example of a regulator which manages, on the whole, to incentivize good performance on its part of its privately owned electricity companies. So, you know, you don't need incentive regulation to do the right thing. And if you have information that the company has, but it's because you don't know what information the company has, and you don't know what the best solution is as a regulator, that you should use incentive-based regulation. What states, of course, in this, we thought it was more important than now. You know, but you know, the United States isn't just one thing. You know, there's a series of electricity regulators at the state level. They do different things. One of the striking things about the United States is, as in so many things, the states came up with a lot of good ideas first, but has struggled to implement them comprehensively. So while performance-based regulation, incentive-based regulation is a US idea, actually it's sort of rolled out rather slowly across US state regulators, as this chapter makes clear. Of course, the UK is a much better example where incentive regulation has taken hold. We've actually got a very sophisticated incentive regulation. It, in about 2010, became broader than it initially was. It focused on a wider range of outputs, in particular trying to incentivize things like connection speed, customer satisfaction, wider stakeholder satisfaction. These are all things that are quite strongly incentivized within the British system, and arguably have delivered quite useful results. The other thing that the UK has pioneered is a CapEx OpEx trade-off. So worries about whether incentive regulation was unduly incentivizing cutting of operating costs, and indeed substitution of operating costs for extra capital costs, led to the development of TOTEX regulation, where there's a tradability between operating expenditure and capital expenditure, and firms are incentivized to jointly optimize both. That has led to a lot of innovation in service procurement at the expense of higher capital investment. So if you can find third parties to expand your network capability by, for instance, managing peak demand, by turning demand down deep within the distribution system, that is something that's incentivized by our system. Of course, you can also look at this in a European context. As I've already mentioned, one of the worries in the European context is that demand is not rising, but everything and everybody tells you we need to expand the network to incorporate more renewables, which tend to be peaky. Whether you actually need to do that or not is questionable, but certainly everybody does say it. And we've got a nice chapter which looks at this in a European context. So back to transmission. So we look at transmission in a number of different countries. Of course, transmission is thought to be important because in a highly renewables-based system, transmission, because the wind and the sun resources are best at the edges of usually of a transmission system, whereas in a fossil fuel-based electricity system, you can put the fossil fuel plants wherever close to the demand centers, and you can have them distributed. Whereas it's best not to distribute a lot of the wind and solar assets. There's pressure to expand the transmission system. The FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, has taken more authority in the US over time over transmission, but actually still struggles to get transmission systems built, and also to get them built quite efficiently, as this chapter discusses. In a European context, one of the things that we've got excited about recently is trying to incentivize generation to locate where there's least cost to the system. So David Newbury has a nice chapter in the book where he's discussing the problem of providing locational signals through transmission charges, which do vary quite significantly across Great Britain and do provide long-run locational incentives for making sure that you take into account the cost of transmission if you're building generation assets which are a long way away from the load system. And increasingly, systems which don't provide good joint generation plus transmission cost signals are going to struggle with the additional costs imposed by people wanting to locate things locate generation a long way away from loads. Okay, this problem of transmission system constraints is also a very live one in Europe. I've mentioned the Dutch case where the Dutch transmission system owner, which is Tenet, have announced huge expansions to the capital base of their transmission company. They've also announced they're going to sell their German transmission business and partly to finance what's going to happen in the Netherlands. One of the reasons why people want to build transmission is because of the need to incorporate long distance renewables, but the problem is, of course, getting any new transmission lines built in Europe is really, really difficult. It's difficult because you can't get local permission to put up the wires. It's also difficult because of supply constraints in the transmission asset construction. And this is going to slow the ability and, of course, suggest that, things need to change in the regulatory system, some of which I might mention later. We have a lovely chapter by Paul Simshauser on the Australian experience. One of the lessons to learn from Australia is don't overexpand your transmission and distribution system. There was an enormous, basically uncontrolled expansion of the network. It's a big network with not a lot of units. If you let transmission and distribution companies, particularly distribution companies, expand the distribution system, you put lots of costs into the system. That happened because of poor regulation in the national electricity market, which is the market in the east of Australia. But the NEM in general has performed well at the wholesale level, but it does have lessons about about how you expand the transmission and distribution system. One of the good ideas to come out of Australia recently has been this first ready, first served connection model. So there's a huge global queue of things wanting to connect to the transmission system. At least 3,000 gigawatts of wind and solar want to connect across the world. They haven't got enough connection capacity. Of course, they're not all maybe necessary. So how do you sort out who's really should be connected first? And in Australia, they've come up with this first ready, first served, where if you've got your asset, you've signed some contracts to purchase your battery, your wind turbine, your solar panels, and you've actually made financial commitments, then you'll get the available connection capacity rather than somebody who hasn't made any financial commitments. And of course, this is a good way of trying to reduce the size of the queue, and seems to have been quite successful. The UK has recently adopted this model. Okay, what about the regulation of retail? Because this is getting really interesting as well. With more renewables, should we have more time-varying retail prices? Time of use pricing is something that's discussed in this chapter by Ahmad Faruqi, and one of his colleagues. Ahmad's one of the foremost authorities on time of day, time of use, real-time pricing. It has increased. Is 9.4% of all US households being on time of use pricing a good thing? And is that high? I mean, I think one of the things it tells you is that people aren't that interested in time of use pricing. If it's taken to 2022 to get 9% of households, and of course it's less in many other countries, most people do actually want flat pricing, but some people are interested in time of use, and he doesn't talk about real-time pricing that much. Energy efficiency is an area where a lot of regulators have made good progress. One of the few things that's been successful in energy policy globally is slowing energy demand growth, especially in advanced countries, where demand has, if anything, fallen since about 2004. And that's partly as a result of energy efficiency, particularly of all energy consuming devices have got more efficient as a result of product standards and improvements in the actual devices themselves, and definitely policies to encourage more energy efficient devices, those things are a good thing. Of course, labeling devices at the time of purchase is one good way of doing that. Okay, so that's the past. What about the future? So we've now got to the chapters that are on the future. We've got a really nice chapter for all economists who want to know something about what this is our chapter. Okay. Of course, entering into the engineering mindset is sometimes a bit mind-bending. But this chapter is really good because this is a chapter by two engineers who are looking at inverter-based resources, which are the non-synchronous generators like wind and solar, not fossil fuel generation, which naturally responds to system frequency. And will adjust if this frequency drops. Fossil fuel generators will increase their fuel draw and their power output, whereas that's not what happens with renewable generators. They point out that actually a lot of this is about reprogramming the performance of wind and solar assets through voltage regulators don't naturally require wind and solar producers to install them, or because they are a bit more expensive, but they do allow the system to be better managed. They also talk about things like inertia on the system. Of course, we did have the or was it caused by people not reading chapters like this and making sure that, you know, actually there was the right level of support in the system? You had a market for inertia, you had ride-through programming in your wind and solar assets, so that these assets responded in the way they should do in the case of a voltage fluctuation, for instance. Okay. Yeah. What about the US? Okay, things change between the commissioning of the book and the publication. But important to say about the US that the US isn't one thing. And a lot of US states have strong decarbonization policies which look a lot like European policy. And it's important to remember that those policies are likely to continue in those states. And this chapter has a nice discussion about some of the positive developments in parts of the United States, things like a lot of voluntary carbon commitments on the part of big companies to net zero, which requires power purchase agreements. But of course, lots of continuing challenges like getting rid of coal in the US system completely. Though, of course, cheap natural gas prices are pretty good at getting rid of okay, and back to the net zero in a European context. Look, there are some interesting developments, particularly within the distribution system. Of course, we don't have locational marginal pricing in Europe, but we do have attempts to balance local supply and demand, particularly deep within the distribution system through changing network access tariffs, for instance, and through smart interruptible connection agreements. You know, why should, if I've got a single wind turbine connected deep within the distribution system, why has that got a 100% export contract where the distribution company has to export all of its output, no matter what the constraint is? Of course, you could simply change the nature of the contract there and say, we're not giving you a firm connection. in return, your connection will be cheaper, but you won't be getting firm connections. So there are things that you can do which are not locational pricing, but which are smarter signals deep within the network, which a lot of European systems are beginning to experiment with. And having these local congestion markets, which are not locational marginal pricing, but they are a form of locational marginal pricing where there actually is a congestion constraint. Of course, not all nodes are congested, but some of them are heavily congested and can benefit from some sharper price signal just being introduced at those nodes. Perry Sioshansi's written loads of stuff on how the world is like California and Australia. Now, I don't believe that. Okay, that the California and Australia, of course, are great. Okay, one of the ideas is, because it's really sunny there and because electricity demand peaks there, all we have to do is match the solar output with the solar demand through, and everybody can be a prosumer. Now, of course, I've spoken to Perry about this. It doesn't really work in Northern Europe, but it might work in Australia and California. One of the things I think Perry is right about is that we should think about more in electricity regulation about telecoms regulation. And one of the reasons why we had such big improvement in the efficiency of the telecoms network is because customers own a lot more of the equipment, and the equipment is plug and play. So a lot of the telecoms equipment into buildings, central business districts, this isn't owned by the telecoms company. Of course, that is what's happening with a lot of prosumage in the electricity system. People are owning their own electricity assets in their own house. That can go further. Energy communities in Europe are attempts to extend that to groups of houses or large buildings. Okay, let me come to my chapter that I wrote with a couple of colleagues. What about the future of regulation itself? What does a future regulator do on the path to net zero? Well, what we say is the regulator, I so wanted to come up with a phrase that somebody will associate with me, but I haven't managed it so far. One is so this is an attempt here. We advocate for something called the learning regulator. We're saying that a regulator that is trying to deliver net zero has to be able to learn from the past, learn in the present, and anticipate key turning points in the future. And we draw on three literatures for that: dynamic regulation, responsive regulation, and adaptive regulation, which are all concepts in the literature. And I owe this diagram to Ofgem, who said, "What are you really saying?" when we were doing this project. And I said, yes, it's all about looking at past information, current information, and anticipating future jumping off points, like if electric vehicles hit this many vehicles, we will need to expand the distribution system or the number of charging points. If suddenly we get a takeoff in electric heat pumps, we will need to reopen the regulation then. But of course, if it doesn't happen, we won't. But we've thought about it beforehand. Okay. So a lot of talk about innovation and the need to innovate. This chapter talks about regulators trying to incentivize innovation. That's been done quite successfully in Italy and in Great Britain, where there have been specific allowances set up where companies can charge more money in order to finance innovation projects. And these projects have been quite successful in both the Italian and the British context. So the question about how regulators can stimulate innovation is nicely discussed in this chapter. Okay, then we get to now we're talking about hydrogen. Gabrielle and I were talking about this. This chapter discusses how to regulate the hydrogen network and whether future energy regulators will also be regulating a hydrogen network. What type of regulation should they have? You know, one of the issues in Europe is, should we have the same type of regulation for a hydrogen network as we have for the electricity system and the methane system, i.e. a vertically unbundled view of the world, where rather than what, of course, people who manufacture hydrogen would like, which is a much more integrated, you know, why can't we initially set up a fully integrated hydrogen company where we produce hydrogen, we own the pipe network, and we supply customers directly, and we don't have to comply with these vertical unbundling rules which exist in electricity and gas, and this chapter discusses that. It's more like an American style approach to gas system organization than the EU style. EV adoption. Well, one of the things in EV adoption, which this chapter discusses in a US context, is, do regulators need to do something to facilitate EV rollout? You know, do we need public charging points to be financed centrally in order to promote EV rollout? And what should we regulate public charging points so they're all plug and play, interchangeable? I mean, answer to the second one is obviously yes. Answer to the first one, not clear. So somebody approached the city of Oxford approached Ofgem and said, can we put up electricity charges in Oxford in the UK in order to put out more public charging points? Ofgem thought about it and thought, you know what, I don't think you've got a mandate to put up electricity prices in Oxford to finance that. But, you know, maybe you could have a mandate for that. Okay. Last three chapters are on non-advanced countries, though some of them are pretty advanced. This chapter is really nice. So Zhu is a political scientist, and she's written about China. Of course, China is amazing. I was in China recently. It's got an amazing electricity system. Electricity is a Chinese product now. Okay, everything about electricity's got China all over it. But, you know, the question for policy reform and electricity regulation in China is, can China ever have truly independent regulation? And Zhu discusses that. Yeah, and whether, if you don't develop independent regulation, can you really sustain investment going into the future on a sort of rational basis? I think one of the things that I keep discussing in the Chinese context is, at some point, electricity demand growth is going to go down in China. At that point, if you haven't got the right institutions in place, investment's going to continue and costs are going to explode in the electricity system. Of course, we haven't reached that. India. Electricity boards being equal to the entirety of healthcare expenditure in India. You know, this is a disaster from an economic point of view. Luckily, this chapter is all about how things are changing in India. And I've spoken to several delegations from India recently, where I think India is finally grasping the need for federal policy which actually works on electricity market reform, and the fact that it can have an electricity market, it can have better regulation of its electricity distribution boards, and it can move on from a sort of very mixed picture at the state level of successful privatizations and unsuccessful ones, and having a very effective independent federal regulatory agency. You know, I think India is beginning to really work on its electricity market, and of course it's got a lot to learn from China. China has had an incredibly successful electricity system, self-financed. It's increasingly introducing a market. It's introduced a carbon market. China's doing all the right things. India's way behind that. Okay, then good to World Bank colleagues. So Deb and Vivian have written this lovely chapter. Of course, Vivian recently wrote a nice book on electricity reform across developing countries. She summarizes a lot of the good stuff in that book in this chapter. I think one thing that she, I'm sure, would want me to emphasize from her chapter is, okay, what you said about all those other places was great, but many low and middle income countries are still struggling with the basics of regulation. Though she has some nice examples in there, I think the Kenya example is particularly interesting, where through very little government support, countries, because they're all in green there and blue. So they've got access to a lot of solar resources and the potential for cheap solar to both solve the access problem and to keep the price of electricity down, and potentially to provide opportunities for exporting green hydrogen to Europe if Europe's willing to pay for it, which it might be if it's sufficiently cheap. Might be. Anyway, I'll stop there. Happy to take questions either now or offline.
You want to stay there, Michael, and then I'll try to organize the questions, and I'm going to switch to Spanish, ya que nuestra audiencia es mayoritariamente en español, pero voy a tratar de
I will switch to Spanish. Since the majority of the audience speaks Spanish, I will try to collect questions. Well, a nice summary. Michael showed us, he gave us a tour through his book that has several chapters but covers all elements of the complexity of the electrical markets. If you look at ChatGPT and ask, what is the industry with most complex regulations, where do you think it will answer? The financing industry? The finance industry, yes. But if you ask, what is the highest complexity of regulatory due to economic and other factors, you will see electrical. And this is an example of how complex this becomes. So I recommend you read this manual, this guideline, because each chapter is written by an author. So the last chapter, it's nice to see that Vivian Foster was a colleague. And Dave talked about a chapter about middle income. So I like that they named it a handbook, because it shows of the theory where Michael talked about pricing over incentives, and then what happens in theory and practice. So it's interesting. A very great summary. So, questions for Michael?
Hi, Michael. I'm going to ask my question in English from the United States. So on the one hand, appreciated some of your jokes about the U.S., but on the other hand, was kind of unnerved, but you're absolutely right about our present moment. So my question goes to the present moment in the U.S., where the U.S. is struggling with the increased demand for data centers and how to regulate the addition of large loads. Have you had the opportunity to look into that? And if so, what are your thoughts on regulatory structures for those?
That's a great question, and lots of people ask me about that. I have worked on data center demand. I think the first thing to say is that if data centers pay the full cost of their addition to the electricity system, that's fine. Okay. You know, one of the things that I think is an important principle is that anybody new being added to the system shouldn't increase the cost for everybody else. That would be wrong. Okay. And especially in systems like in Europe and North America, where otherwise demand would be flat. Okay. So, you know, what we've written about is, yes, you can connect your data center as long as you do pay for the deep costs of connection, as long as you are providing backup facilities to the grid. So, you know, what often a data center wants is it wants an uninterruptible power supply, which is just one way. You protect me at all costs. I don't ever protect you. Okay. And I'm pleased to say that, you know, there is now data center regulation in the European Union, and it's trying to make data centers more responsible consumers, because of course the IT sector often is quite secretive about what its underlying demand is in a way that a typical industrial load never was. Okay, so, you know, often a regulator might want to know, well, look, what is the driver of your demand? You know, can you give us more accurate projections of when demand might peak? Because often what data center connectees often want is they want a lot of guaranteed capacity, which they then don't make full utilization of. And, you know, I've talked to distribution companies where they say, actually, these companies are some of the most inaccurate in terms of their prediction of what their load might be. So I think there's work to do on both sides to have more transparency and, you know, actually pay the true costs, which are actually quite high if you think about it, because typically what the data center wants is it wants lots of capacity now, but it doesn't necessarily want to commit to it in 20 years' time. And so if it's paying for network capacity annually, the danger is you've got stranded assets, which then fall back on general consumers. So I think thinking this through more carefully and requiring the data centers to pay more upfront is the obvious answer.
Okay, por allí, el micrófono.
Hi, hello, from Brazil, the Minister of Mines and Energy. And I want to catch a question for you about the TSOs and DSOs. You showed to us a chapter specific on that. In Brazil, we have already only the TSO, the main operator, national operator of the system. And we're discussing right now about the opportunities to have in Brazil DSOs by law or by regulatory framework from the regulatory body. So I want to hear a little more from you about this recommendation, this opportunity to have DSOs to improve the condition transmission and distribution systems.
So, are you asking me about a distribution system operator
Por
that is more
sistemas de distribución operadas que se comporten como empresa de transmisión en cuanto a operar el sistema activamente? Sí, y la oportunidad de tener aquel para mejorar las condiciones operativas del sistema. Sí, bien. Esto es una pregunta complicada porque creo que la transmisión, distribución es arbitraria. El límite entre ambos es arbitrario en muchos países. Donde se dibuje y es como a veces se diseña base. Así que una pregunta sobre a qué nivel operarán el sistema. Así que creo que hablabas del Christoph, algunos que escribieron sobre los niveles en la cual se tienen, algunas personas tienen la idea de que se tiene un único sistema nacional que operaría el sistema completo hasta el nodo más pequeño, aunque no le pertenezca. Y creo que esto es partamente donde el operador del sistema energético nacional esté pensando en Reino Unido, donde hay, por ejemplo, ahora normas ISO donde separan activos eléctricos. Así que, ¿cuál es la ventaja del tener un sistema operacional a nivel distribuido y embotellado. Creo que hay oportunidad para competencia saludable en la capa de transmisión y distribución. En distribución a veces hay acceso a clientes individuales, mientras que la capa de transmisión creo que Reino Unido es de unos 200 clientes en total, mientras que la empresa de distribución llega a millones. Así que está este elemento más bien de estar en terreno y la competencia en infraestructura y organización TI requerida. Así que definitivamente sí se ven competencias entre la capa de transmisión que quiere más supervisión, lo que sucede a nivel de distribución, y a nivel de distribución que ven oportunidades para entrar hacia una visión más superficial y ampliada. Así que creo que dependerá, y donde hemos terminado en Gran Bretaña es competencia
And some of these local
y
procurement markets
algunos
for congestion are best operated by the distribution layer, not just aggregated to the transmission layer.
Perhaps, yeah, por favor. Y no sé si le podamos pasar el micrófono al
We'll
colega.
pass him the microphone to the colleague.
¿No funciona?
It doesn't work.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, Esteban from Chile. So you talk about the massive increase of the energy distributed sources, and you also mentioned some example, particularly in the US, in California. My question is related to the prosumers, like a residential level or commercial level. Do you think peer-to-peer, like electricity trading market can be like a local market created there, like an option? What do you think may be one of the main regulatory framework or aspect that we should consider to something like that?
Okay, I spent 5 years working in a project on exactly this. And I had a computer scientist friend, Jeremy Pitt, at Imperial, and he's loved this idea of peer-to-peer trading of electricity. And I said to him, look, Jeremy, the only thing that this can do is add cost. It might be very small, but you're going to have to label this electron as to where it came from. So that must strictly increase cost, even if it's over zero. So I said, look, why can't you think of examples where peer-to-peer trading might be worth it? Like, we've got one parking space for the electric vehicle charging point on the street, and we're going to operate a sort of bidding system among the people who live on the street. Okay, that might be an application of peer-to-peer trading, which makes sense, but the labeling of electrons is crazy. And that's what I concluded from 5 years. I'm thinking, yeah, you know, because the point is these are tiny transactions. You know, a typical household in the UK consumes less than 10 a day. You know, this is nonsense to trade this. You know, at that sort of level. You know, and you know, I work at a business school. I wouldn't get out of bed to trade that.
And it really takes an academic to tell you that doesn't make economic sense, right? Okay, so we'll then continue with our next presentation, but can you please help me to give us a little bit? Thank you, Michael, for this excellent presentation. Okay, tenemos a... Yo siempre digo que Luis Barroso es una celebridad de... No solo del tema de Brasil, pero...
I always say that Luis Barros is not only a celebrity from Brazil, but now we'll present the Brazilian case, specifically the distribution aspects.
Hola, ¿qué tal? ¿Todo bien? Yo hablo también español, que Gabriela me pidió
Hello,
que hablara.
I also speak Spanish, but she asked me to speak in English. No, so it's a joke.
And Gabriela, and Marcela, and Carlos, thank you very much for the invitation to be joining this session. It was a privilege to learn from Professor Michael Pollitt, and I loved the presentation. I loved the book. We have many common friends, so most of your authors. They're also friends of mine, and I just endorse what Gabriela has said, that this is a really good stuff, really good material. So Gabriela and these very nice people from the World Bank, they gave me like this long list of topics to present today. And every day I received an additional email saying, can you cover this? And can you also cover this? And I was coming here to the hotel, and then Carlos was calling me, can you now cover this and this? And I said, come on, guys. So what I did was the following. I did this very comprehensive presentation, and my slides will be available for you, okay? So I have a lot of data, a lot of information on the Brazilian case, but I'll try to stick as much as I can to the messages, because I think that the message that I have to share with you, they are very, very interesting on the art of how to do things, on the art of how not to do things, and on the art of the challenge on how to fix things. I think that in the end of the day, it's my story. So this is pretty much the overview of the topics that I plan to cover with you today. And let me just start by saying that I come from this very, little country in Latin America, 5 times world champion of soccer. We are 220 million people. And we have, besides being 5 times world champion of soccer, Brazil is the world champion of availability of natural resources. We have pretty much of everything, and our supply mix is pretty renewable. Today, our chief renewable is not green energy, but is blue energy, is the good and old, the hydropower. We have a lot of storage. The system has around 240,000 megawatts of generation capacity. Hydro accounts for roughly 50% of that. Renewables have taken a big step in this supply mix. The country has a very robust transmission grid. So for us, high voltage is anything greater than 230 kV. So again, arbitrary. But we have a network which is has a length of about 200,000 kilometers that has been functioning quite well to create synergies, to bring resilience, to leverage the complementarities between the production of the different resources that have production complementarity all over. Not only the hydro plants, they have complementarities in their hydrological regimes all over the country, because Brazil's surface area is 8.5 square kilometers. This is literally the same size of the continental US plus half of Alaska. But also the renewables, they have production complementarity with water, which is the case of wind and water. And also the sun has a lot of complementarity with load, because whenever the sun is shining, peak load increases, we have a lot of demand for air conditioning, and sun can come and eat a bunch of it. So the management of this beautiful portfolio of resources is pretty leveraged by a robust transmission grid. The interesting thing about Brazil is that for the past 5 years, the country 78 gigawatts, so 80 gigawatts of new generation capacity, period. Okay, renewables accounted for 95% of that. Besides renewable, we had gas, but distributed generation accounted for 50% of this delta. Okay, so Gabriela is from the time that Brazil had only 20 gigawatts of distributed generation. This was a long time ago, maybe in the past century. I'm going to get there in a while. But at distributed generation, solar PV has really taken a leadership in driving the supply expansion of Brazil for reasons that I'm going to detail with you in a while. So this is what we have been having. You have the figures here until 2024, and then I just put 2025 separately, and those figures in light orange represent the growth of DG, and the DG is basically 99% of solar PV. Okay, and in terms of market reforms, Brazil has, Gabriela called them as the olas, like the waves. And the Brazil had clearly 3 waves, which are pretty similar to the waves that other Latin American countries had as well. We started things in the 90s, basically with the wholesale markets and everything based on spot pricing theory. We basically had the British consultants and the folks from Coopers and Lybrand. They sold us their model, the British model. And basically, we implemented the spot market, spot pricing theory all over. The motivation for Brazil to do the reform was not because the system was in a bad condition, but because the government didn't have money to fund the expansion of the networks and also the generation system. We did RPI minus X regulation for distribution. We implemented back in the day independent transmission projects carried out via auctions. And our spot market was based on marginal cost. So we have this centralized cost-based regime, pretty much as the one that Chile has, where a computational model in its infinite wisdom dispatches all the generation resources and sets the market price as a byproduct of the model itself. This system did not deliver what it was supposed to deliver, and Brazil had a rationing in 2001, basically due to the lack of ability of the spot prices to provide the signals for system expansion. Basically, we died, and when we died, when we resurrected, we basically embarked into this wave of the reliability markets. So we embarked into this wave of creating competition for the market, where we created a long-term market, encouraging new entrants to compete to enter the market. Before we had the competition in the market, first people had to enter, then to compete on a daily basis to make their money. And this was when renewable auctions expanded rapidly, and Brazil did a lot of work. I'm gonna get there soon. Nowadays, what we have in the country, basically, it's an industry that is almost 100% private over the value chain, an industry where distributed generation has grown exponentially, an industry where renewables, they have created a lot of challenges for planning, operations, and on the financial side of the system, on the subsidies, and a lot of debates on how to finally, after 30 years, we start our market reform, finally, how to create correct prices to provide correct signals for everybody. Okay, so we are, Professor Pollitt, maybe 30 years late in this discussion, but we are, as Bon Jovi says, we're halfway there. Okay, we are getting there. Okay, so let me start. Cool things that I wanted to share with you about what we've been doing in Latin America, actually in Brazil specifically. Long-term contracting, the spot price signals that we take from our spot markets, they are very contaminated by the hydrology. Hydrology introduces a lot of noise, and they do not provide correct signals for system expansion. The financial markets are very underdeveloped. Basically, we cannot hedge. People cannot hedge. There are no liquid markets. And the finance institutions, they impose very strict terms to finance merchant-based generation investments because of the credibility from the spot market. It's very pretty much ignored. And because of that, about 20 years ago, Brazil has came up with those long-term markets that this is very well explained in the book that I like very much, this book, because I helped to write it. So jokes aside, it was co-written with a former World Bank colleague, Luis Maurer. And basically, the idea is to create some sort of a forward contract in advance by fixing the capacity that needs to be procured ahead of time and creating what Professor Peter Crampton named it as an investment market. I love this expression. So there's an investment market for reliability products that aims to mitigate market, policy, and of course political risks while enhance tariff predictability. So one conclusion that we have from this book is that even if governments change, the results of a fully competitive, transparent process do not change, and they are very hard to be challenged with the successive changes of government. So those auctions, they do not operate in vacuum. They are an integral part of the market reforms. They are so-called hybrid markets. We have a spot market, we have a long-term market, we have auctions, you know, of different sizes, flavors, and types, and it's really pretty dynamic. And those auctions, they have been procuring reliability, they have been procuring renewables because they have been technology specific. So the planner has been factoring on the procurement processes the elements of system planning that needs to be factored in order to produce the optimal mix for the system, taking into account what is needed. And this is what we have been calling as competition for the market, and similar auction models have been used in other Latin American countries with different agreements, different implementation arrangements. So Colombia, for example, auctions just the reliability through a reliability option. The Chileans, they auction just the energy, the capacity payment is separated. So, but pretty much the ingredients are the same, the conceptual approach is pretty much the same. The Brazilian results are awesome. The system auctioned a lot of capacity, so 100 gigawatts since 2005. You have the figures here, you have the prices. Brazil has been procuring capacity and energy altogether for an all-in price of something around the $50 for all technologies and $44 per megawatt hour only for renewables. And then we have here all the statistics. The same auction approach has been used for transmission. So Brazil does this independent transmission project approach, where we have central planning for future reinforcements, and an auction making sure that those reinforcements will be procured at the lowest possible cost with some incentive regulation behind. And again, we've been auctioning as crazy. The system almost doubled in size in the past 12 years of the transmission auctions. Okay, so utility scale renewables story. Uh, Cool thing about Brazil, the renewable resource in Brazil is fascinating. The resource is very good. The wind is very good. The sun is very good. I don't know what Brazilians did to deserve that, but I can tell you that a very bad wind plant has a load factor of a 44%. Okay, which is fantastic. Okay, so on average, when you compare, for example, of the quality of the wind resource in the Midwest, for example, the US, which is around 25% or so, the quality of the resource for wind and for the sun is superb in Brazil. And this has basically given a lot of advantages for these technologies, because if the capex is the same all over, basically the denominator of the dollar per megawatt hour equation is lower, because the denominator is bigger in Brazil, the total price tends to be lower. Competition has been very fierce in the auction, and the balancing costs to integrate renewables used to be very competitive because we have hydro. And hydro use it to deliver, to do the job. I'm being very cautious with the verb use it, because I'm going to tell you afterward what are the challenges now. And hydros have been delivering the balancing cost at a very affordable price. So this has made renewables very interesting for the country and very competitive. And the results of the renewable auctions have been amazing by themselves. You have the statistics here. This is a subset of the charts that I have shown you before. But what is interesting is that if you compare on the left side of the chart what we have today in terms of renewable, and if we break down per technology from where this procurement has come, separating between the auctions and the corporate PPAs, the so-called free market, the free market has had a role not only on wind but mostly on solar. And if you take on the right side of the chart what is the new renewable capacity forecasted to start in operation till 2030, you see that the eligible market, the free market, the corporate PPA market is driving almost 50% of this capacity addition. In Brazil, every consumer that is connected to the high voltage system at any load is eligible. So the consumers connected to the lower level of the system, they are not eligible. So I'm not an eligible consumer myself, but all the small, medium, and large industrials and commercial segments, they are eligible to go to the free market and to procure power as they want. So this has been a very active market. The tricky details is that renewables, they have a subsidy when they sell power to the free market. They don't pay 50% of their transmission costs. And if a consumer signs a PPA with this renewable, the consumer, her or himself, does not pay 50% of its own transmission costs. This is a lot of money. This subsidy altogether can amount some $20 per megawatt hour. This is not little. This is something that little by little has been increasing, as I'll be showing to you in a bit. The utility scale story has been complemented by the distributed generation drama. Okay, this has become over. This is beyond from being a good story. This is actually a drama. Why? Basically, because Brazil has a net metering policy that was introduced in 2012, which is very generous. It's a compensation on a volume basis. Basically, it's 101. So whoever has the DG installed can compensate, can generate credits to be used from the energy produced at any time of the day, which of course is during the sun time, but that can be used at any time of the day. So I can generate excess a day and use the grid to provide me backup at night and pay zero for electricity. And the first net metering policy did not even assign to the DG owners the network costs. So they don't pay absolutely nothing for the use of the battery that they have of the system, which is the distribution system. And those credits, they are valid for 5 years. Okay, so there's a lot of credits in place still to be used. To make the life of Brazilians more miserable, the regulator allowed the concept of a remote distributed generation to happen. Remote DG is super cool. 5 megawatt plants located far from the consumer that can basically be eligible to the benefits of the net metering by selling power through a consortium via a sharing ownership of the plant. But of course, that myself, I will never ever share the ownership of a 5 megawatt plant. So what people do is based on some of contractual arrangements that I subscribe to the production of this plant, and I become owner of a little bit of distributed generation with all those benefits. So Professor Michael Pollitt, if you need an ambulance, just let me know, okay? Don't have a heart attack, okay? If you want to go out for a stroll, maybe it's going to be better, okay, for you, because I'm joking. So basically, this is something that is very aggressive, okay? Because the remote DG accounts for 30% of the market, but for 70% of the credits because of the capacity of those plants. So the combination of good resources, falling capex, tax exemptions, rising end users rates, business models via subscriptions, and blah, 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 with a lot of communication and social media and so on, has basically expanded DG. And we have today, Gabriela, 43 gigawatts of distributed generation. This is the second technology in installed capacity in Brazil after hydropower. So first we have hydropower, then we have a solar PV as DG, and you have the numbers here much higher than what we have of utility scale solar. So every company, every firm has its DG business. Even the distribution companies, they have their side businesses as DG, the generation company. So this thing has really gone completely out of control. And you can see some examples of things that come up in social media. So find out how to make money with solar energy by subscription, how does it work? Save 20% on your energy bill, save 40% on your energy bill. This is all over, and this has empowered a lot of people that are basically buying energy from remote production, getting entitled to the DG benefit. So this story has been very complicated because the stories of renewables has produced a lot of adverse impacts in the system, starting from the famous duck curve. So this is on the left side, the duck curve as projected by the Brazilian national system operator. But if you forecast this onwards in time, we found out that the neck of the duck is becoming really steep. And then we found this animal here. That's an animal is called tuyuyu. Okay, so I put here on a Wikipedia, okay, because this tuyuyu has a neck that is more steep than the neck of the duck. So we're going to the tuyuyu curve, and as you know, as the Brazilians here knew, but what eventually you do know is that our wholesale market design hinders pretty much the signals for flexibility, because Brazil does not have real-time prices. We don't have a day-ahead market. We have a day-ahead planning. We don't have a market for pricing of ancillary services or reserves. Everything is cost-based, defining on via regulated tariffs. And the hydro plants, they basically they're not being properly compensated by providing the service that they do. Demand response does not get attractive to all of that because they don't see the prices, and when they see the prices for reserves, it's like a regulated tariff. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in the wholesale market design. But why we have that is basically because there is a saying that I use to say in my presentations. I always cite Hamlet, Shakespeare. So in your homage, because Shakespeare said in Hamlet, Though maybe madness, there is method in it. Okay, so and the method is that the Brazilian market design was designed back in the day under the assumption of this infinite flexibility provided by hydropower, and basically the cost of reserves, provision, and everything was zero, absolutely zero. So nobody cared, all those British people, nobody cared about the cost of actually doing those things. But the mix changed quite a lot. Hydro operation has become more and more restricted due to constraints for the use of the water for other stuff rather than to power. This has been a big issue. And this has paved the way for gas-fired plants to start to have a role in dispatching for flexibility. So Brazil is a country where gas may have a role. Of course, we need to talk about gas prices and about the gas supplier, of course, and the business model. But gas is starting to take a toll because of the need to have flexibility from the supply side. As you can imagine, a lot of renewables curtailment. So a lot of power has been curtailed. Solar has been suffering the most. The numbers, they are very big. So in this table that you find on the right side of the slide, you have the gigawatt hours, the energy curtailed in numbers, massive numbers, and growing. Roughly 50% of the cuts happen due to lack of demand, the so-called market curtailment. But we have a lot of grid curtailment, which is the curtailment done because of reliability and transmission. And the system operator has been very vocal, that is very concerned that we may soon, and by soon I mean 2029, get to the day where Brazil will have so much electricity that will have eventually to curtail generation during the day and have some difficulties to supply at night in order to meet all the ramps. And the system operator said once in public that we might need to curtail generation during the day and curtail load at night. This was a total mess, as you can imagine. But this is all public. You can also check those things. But again, these are the challenges to a system that has thought to have infinite flexibility, but flexibility is much more limited now than what it was. Now, to make life more interesting, Brazil had a blackout 2 years ago, massive blackout. We had to cut about 30% of the load for 9 hours. It was really a blackout, pretty similar to the one that Chile had, I think, last year. But the diagnosis of the ISO was very interesting, that the blackout happened because of lack of insufficient response of the renewables regarding voltage control. So pretty connected to what Professor Pollitt said on the inverter-based resources and so on. So as you can imagine, this has been a big discussion because the ISO is now saying that the system is more vulnerable because renewables are not doing the job on those milliseconds of the real-time operations. But this is actually a big consequence of a country that has never ever treated renewables as adults. And by treating a technology which has become really big as a children, basically people don't care about the requirements. At the end of the day, this is charging the price. Now, subsidies. So the regulator creates something that is called el subsidiómetro. Okay, as el subsidiometer. Okay, so this is public. This is public. So I took this data from a news website. You can check it yourself. So roughly, only 2025, roughly, only until September, Brazil is paying $4 billion in renewable subsidies. This is six times higher than what is paid in subsidies for energy access, which is a lot. Okay, and most of those subsidies go to distributed generation. So as you can imagine, this is something you can explore the subsidiometer. It's very interesting. But this was the voice that the regulator had to make things loud and clear to everybody. Distributed generation impacts. First of all, we have this situation that the rich subsidizes the poor, subsidizes the rich. If only the rich could subsidize the poor. But the poor subsidizes the rich. And basically, the high-income population concentrates most of the solar PV installations. We have a lot of regulatory issues. So, for example, we do RPI minus X regulation, Professor Pollitt, but the tariffs for the low voltage consumer, they are volumetric. So as you can imagine, the revenues, the distribution companies disappeared, and we have all the headaches that I'm pretty sure that Professor Pollitt's books will tell us how to fix. We also have the challenge of the investment cycles because the tariff review cycles in Brazil the last 5 years, but the distribution companies have to invest a lot in the networks to cope with the DG growth, and they have a remuneration challenge. To make our life even more miserable, lack of observability because the ISO does not see this distributed generation. So Karina from the Ministry of Mines and Energy, she asked this question about the distribution system operator because we need someone to control this mess. And now we need the DSO basically to make those little, gremlins to do things good for the system, to take value out of them. That's a big discussion now. Reverse power flows have been affecting curtailment. There is one interesting legal issue because the net metering is built to be self-supply. So to what extent the subscription model is legally valid, because the subscription model is actually a commercial transaction and the net metering period is not meant to be this way. And we lack tariff structure in price signals that handles the pricing of the costs and the benefits of DG, because the DG folks, they say, but we have benefits, we are good for the system. But because our pricing structure is ill-defined, those values, if they exist, of course, they do not appear because there are no prices to basically unlock and to review this. There is a study that just came up yesterday and is going to be released that touches a lot on the distributed generation conflicts, on the distributional effects. I think it's very good for you all to have a look. These are the questions that this study addresses. This study was not done by me and not by my firm. It was done by somebody else, by a colleague called Marco Delgado, an expert. He stayed some time in Suffolk University doing his postdoc, and this was the outcome of a lot of stuff that he did in there. It's very worthy for you all to have a look. So, the challenge to fix the system. So first of all, is communication. So whenever we want to do things right, some people come and say, don't correct the price signals, don't do multi-part tariffs, because if you do this, you'll be taxing the sun. And taxing the sun is illegal. And then we have the other people that these people here created a very interesting campaign with the little cats, and the little cats shows how, complicated those subsidies are. So this communication war that has been very much empowered by social media has created a lot of difficulties to set a table where everybody can be together and have proper discussions on a technical basis. So this is something that is happening in other countries as well, but the power of social media, the power of the communication, especially from this number of consumers, that are using distributed generation, that wanted to be empowered, that they believe they are empowered somehow, this create a lot of mess for the regulatory authorities. So where do we go now? So basically, this is my penultimate slide. So my messages for you are very simple. So Brazil is the paradise of renewable energy. Brazil is a country where renewable is also competitive. So in the US outlook now, where competitive energy is the way to by the regulator, and if nothing is done, the system will collapse. So what we need to do is we need a pact, we need some sort of an agreement to sit everybody together to kind of restart the system, to rebuild, so that we can keep the good of the system, fix the bad, of course, and try to handle well the ugly. This is not easy because we have a lot of legacies from what we did since back in the days in 1996, but the list of things we're doing is pretty much here, at least that we are working on. This is my last slide in terms of content. This paper that I did on the IEEE Power and Energy magazine, I think was last year, describes pretty much what have been the efforts. But this is the list. I'm not going to go through all of this. You keep this for your reading. But that's pretty a standard list that is valid for other countries as well, including the discussion. It's detailed in here. So thank you very much. I think I'm right on time.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias, Luis, por esta presentación tan interesante. Yo siempre he pensado en los
Thank you,
mercados
Luis, for such an interesting presentation. It's an evolution that has been a saga, but we haven't thought of the electrical markets as a drama, like a Shakespeare, right? So, questions from the audience for Luis? We have 5 minutes and then we will have a break. We will be back at 4 for a roundtable of ex-regulators. We have 5 minutes more for questions.
Luis, on the light of this drama, and recently the data center became into the picture in Brazil, with posing a big challenge to the transmission systems. How do you see this challenge to how they can be addressed?
It's a challenge everywhere. The connection challenge is not a privilege of Brazil and of Latin America. This is the case of other countries. But I think that the main challenge, Carlos, falls back to Professor Pollitt's answer to the question that he was posed, which is how to avoid the creation of a cross-subsidy, basically between the people that will be adding significant amount of new loads, and that they don't wanna pay basically network costs. They wanna have priority in the access, they wanna have a cheap energy, and if the proper cost of the investments that these people will bring to the grid is not properly correctly assigned to them, we'll get in trouble more and more, and the death spiral, in all its different dimensions, will just come again, and with the consumers being able to get rid out of the grid, so this can be really complicated. But it's coming. We have significant volumes. There is an agenda in place. The connection is an issue, but I'm more concerned with the ability of the institutions in the country to charge these newcomers the correct costs that they will add to the system, pretty much in line with Professor Pollitt's answer.
Una más por allá, por favor.
Thank you, Professor Barroso, for your presentation. You talk about the death spiral. That means that the presence of distributed generations, what it makes is that it reduces the flows of energy through the distribution network. So that means that the network has to be paid by those users who don't have distributed generation. In your opinion, would you rather to limit the distributed generations facilities or to change the model on how we provide revenue to the distribution network? Because at least in Chile, what happens is that with such an high energy tariff, what we are experiencing right now is that most of clients, large clients, are installing facilities behind the meter. And that has nothing to do with feed-in tariff of net metering. It's just behind the meter because it's most cost effective from their perspective. So what's going to happen in the rest of Latin America if we continue with this model of having a volumetric revenue scheme for this distribution company? How can we deal with that issue?
In summary, we're going to get in big trouble. Okay, we're going to get in big trouble. And the thing is that different markets deal with this in different ways. So, for example, again, taking the Brazilian case as an example, we don't have full retail competition. So, because we don't have full retail competition, distributed generation has been taking the place of the retail competition because I cannot migrate to the market, but I can subscribe to a distributed generation easily. So if retail competition comes up, basically when the traders look to me, I'm gone. Okay, I'm with my DG, and I'm exporting costs to everybody else. I think that the challenge is somehow to incentivize the installation of batteries of storage in a way that these people that are going completely behind the meter, that they can basically disconnect. They put the batteries and so bye-bye, baby. But the problem is that nobody wants to leave mama's house. Okay, people want to get rid of mama's costs due to flawed net metering policies. Okay, so I think this should be the way to go. How to do this? I'm trying to build things on the reverse order. You need to do multi-part tariff structures. You need to break the volumetric tariff. You need to do dynamic pricing. You need to connect retail price signals with the wholesale price signals, which there is a big disconnection all over Latin America. So sometimes the wholesale market is suffering a lot to deliver. And in the retail market, my mom does not have a clue. I don't have a clue. I have because I'm in the industry, but my mom, she's just basically ignoring everything that is happening up there. So there was a lot of, and that's why I joked that 30 years after Brazil started the market reform, we are discussing price signals because I think that we overlook it, Professor Pollitt, quite a lot, the role that a correct tariff structure, that connection between wholesale and retail signals, they could have to drive the investments on for the low voltage consumer. It's not going to be easy to change this because we have many legacies in place. So if you do, I mean, Brazil tried to do a multi-part tariff structure a few years ago, and there was this big campaign of the solar people that the regulator was trying to tax the sun. Okay. And this is something that Karina knows this. When I was in the government in 2017, we had 290 megawatts of DG, 290. So I proposed a bill project that tried to fix a lot of those things. This project didn't pass, not I proposed, but together with a team of people, and my minister did it. And today we have 43 gigawatts. So the problem is too big. So it's like how to fix this. Have you tried to put toothpaste inside the tube after you press the tube? It's very difficult. It's very difficult. But sometimes, you know, your sink gets so dirty with the toothpaste all over that you need to clean up. And so this is the type of cleanup. I'm sorry by using these analogies, but it's pretty much the way we're going. And this is not a privilege of Brazil. Okay, I'm using Brazil here as an example, but other countries will get in similar situation pretty soon. Okay, so we need the World Bank, Professor Pollitt, to help us.
And we need Anel to pay
We need
attention.
Anel, but Anel is paying attention. I
But
think
why is Anel not changing the net metering? What is the political force against?
we had a law that adjusted the net metering, Gabriela, in 2022, that basically created a guidance to reduce little by little the subsidies. That is, to make people to pay more and more the network costs until 2029. Okay, so from 2029, all the network costs will be paid. But the problem is that the damage now is just it's too late, because this is valid only for the new capacity additions of DG. And the problem is that we have 43 gigawatts that benefits from this scheme until 2045, Gabriela, 2045. Okay, so in the end of the day, we need a pact. We need to sit on the table and use the U.S. experience, the experience from Texas, from California, to say, hey, the remuneration has been already secured much faster than what was forecasted. Let's reset and try to rebuild the system in a different way, by valuing the technologies for how much they deliver, by charging them for the costs that they have to the system. And if the benefit cost ratio is positive, good for you. If it isn't, life is hard.
I think you need a pact, no? Look at the Dominican Republic, a different type of pact, but it's important to bring the politics into. One more question, and then we go to a coffee break.
Thank you. My English is terrible. I will go in Spanish.
You can speak in Spanish. Yeah.
Thank you. Tres cosas. La primera, si no crees que puede
If you
económicamente
think you can economically resolve part of the crossroad of generation by internalizing external things that are external. I will use a hypocritical term because, I'm sorry, I can barely hear his microphone. And to continue with a marginalist system where dispatchable sources are managed, and we would have to manage completely different technologies.
Okay, so I would assume that you have understood his question, okay? So you have
Asumiré que entiendes sus preguntas. Y bien, para la primera, tienes razón de que hay hipocresías entre los diferentes accionistas.
Changes, it's more difficult. Those changes to make them work, it's easier said than done. Okay, so let's not underestimate the ability of these people to kind of get together and basically void any effort to correctly calculate the costs and benefits of DG. As for example, there is one resolution by the National Council of Energy Policy, which is the Council of Ministers that advises the presidents of the country. I'm part of this council. And this resolution says that within until a deadline, until a date, the ministry has to calculate the costs and the benefits of DG, pretty much trying to internalize the externalities. Total mess. Because people, they want to have the benefits, they don't want to pay the costs. Whenever you calculate the costs, they go to social media and they go to the congressman, it is chaos. Okay, so it's a communication war in the end of the day. So I'm totally with you here, and I think that we still have a battle ahead. This is not easy. On marginal pricing theory, this is, it touches my heart because I strongly believe on Professor Schwepp's, books from the MIT, and also know the work that the Brits have done on marginal pricing. But Brazil has already got pretty rid of the marginal pricing with the auctions by creating separated markets for generation in the transmission. And on distribution, what we need to do is to adjust the business model to try to create the utility of the future, use the MIT nomenclature. Try to separate the wire business from the retailing business and try to create some sort of value that the networks provide to the system, because the networks, they do have a value, they add value. People just realize the value of the networks when we go there and cut the network, because then you have no sun at night, okay? And I think that ANEEL, the regulator, is doing a lot of work. It's difficult for ANEEL because they suffer a lot of pressure, so they need to be empowered by the Congress, by politics, and this is where we have a danger, because a big portion of our Congress has a lot of interest on gas, for example. And then we have a third element, which is the element of adding gas into the discussion. And in the end of the day, it all falls back to the lack of price signals, because the people, sometimes they top up different solutions to the same problem just because they believe gas will do better than demand response. But the poor demand response doesn't even have any price signals to try it. Eventually, some small signal, demand response could do some job and could help the system on the flexibility challenge. So again, my main message is that it has never ever been so important for Brazil and also for other countries to work on price signals on short-term intervals, so that the correct costs and benefits of those technologies, they come up in all value chain, from generation to distribution to a tariff structure.
Luis, muchísimas gracias por esta master presentation.
Thank you for this master presentation. We will go to a break and come back. We will be back at 4.
Bueno, buenas tardes a todos. Gracias por volver después de su coffee break relativamente puntuales. Hola, hola, ¿me oyen bien ahí? Bueno, vamos a seguir con nuestro taller de aspectos regulatorios en el sector eléctrico y los desafíos para América Latina. Vamos a cambiar un poco el formato. Tuvimos esta primera parte con la participación de Michael Pollitt y de Luis Barroso, que nos contaron cuáles son los desafíos de la regulación. Los distintos países han tratado o tratan de adaptarse a los cambios tecnológicos y ir adecuando sus regulaciones para poder dar respuesta y poder generar incentivos y tratar de desarrollar y mantener sistemas que sean resilientes y que aseguren la seguridad de suministro. Bueno, un poco el objetivo de la sesión de esta tarde, de esta segunda parte, digamos, de esta tarde, es conversar aquí con Andrés Romero, Ramón Méndez y Cristian Jaramillo, los tres expertos regionales en temas de regulación, y charlar un poco con ellos sobre, bueno, qué pasa en América Latina, cómo vemos que esté América Latina preparada para enfrentar estas cuestiones. Sabemos que la región es una región muy heterogénea, no todos los países tienen la misma madurez regulatoria ni los mismos desafíos, pero sí sabemos que estamos todos transitando esta situación en la que de alguna manera corremos un poco detrás. Entonces sabemos que hay experiencias de algunos países que pueden enriquecer a otros, hay ejemplos que pueden ser más interesantes desde un punto de vista de los desafíos que incorporan o que tratan de resolver desde un punto tecnológico, y otros que tienen desafíos más menos actuales en algunos sentidos, pero que también tienen que ser atacados para poder responder a los problemas que vienen de arrastre y que tienen que incorporar los nuevos, ¿no? Porque el sector es uno solo y los problemas no son solo los que están entrando ahora con la generación distribuida, con los autos eléctricos, con el almacenamiento y con la cripto y con los data centers. Son todos esos más las pérdidas, ¿no? Que en muchos de nuestros países, más el acceso, que también se mencionó, ¿no? Entonces, eso es un poco lo que tenemos en América Latina, ¿no? Países que tienen estos problemas, los data centers que estábamos hablando, la cripto, las demandas puntuales, distintas penetraciones de electromovilidad. Estamos viendo en Chile, por ejemplo, buses, penetración altísima, pero también vemos países donde los niveles de pérdidas siguen siendo muy altas, donde la sostenibilidad, la distribución de la infraestructura es muy baja, donde la generación distribuida está recién empezando, y otros como Brasil, donde vimos que tuvo un salto enorme, pero que también eso está generando desafíos, ¿no? Y por eso el mismo Luis decía, bueno, ¿cómo vamos a hacer para resolver estos desafíos? Entonces, evidentemente, todos estos problemas, esta variedad, no es fácil. No pensamos salir con una solución ni con una receta que sirva para toda la variedad que implica a América Latina, pero sí generar este espacio de discusión y poder ver cuáles ideas van surgiendo y cómo entre todos, con la experiencia de nuestros panelistas y después también abriendo al público, podemos tratar de entender estos problemas y ver cuáles podrían ser las opciones para ir atacándolos. Así que bueno, en ese contexto les agradecemos muchísimo a los tres. Los presento rápidamente. Bueno, Andrés Romero, él es socio y director de la consultora Valgesta y entre los años 2014 y 2018 fue secretario ejecutivo de la Comisión Nacional de Energía de Chile. Y bueno, en su desarrollo profesional se especializó en regulación, mercados energéticos, políticas públicas y reformas institucionales. Ramón Méndez es desde marzo de 2025 el presidente de REN 21, la red renovable global, y es el director ejecutivo de IBI, que es un think do tank que asesora a gobiernos del sector privado para introducir y promover las renovables. Entre el 2008 y 2013 fue el director de energía de Uruguay, y entre 2015 y 2016 fue el secretario de Cambio Climático. Y por último lo tenemos a Cristian Jaramillo, es socio fundador de On Point Consulting, asesor en materia de políticas públicas, análisis económico y regulación y temas energéticos, y se ha desempeñado como comisionado y director ejecutivo de la Comisión de Regulación de Energía y Gas en Colombia. Así que bueno, hechas las presentaciones, nos vamos a ir pasando el micrófono. Y me pidieron los colegas de allá que están haciendo todo lo mejor para que esto se oiga bien, no solo aquí, sino también en la transmisión. Entonces lo pasamos, esto que hice recién es lo que no hay que hacer. Yo hablo, dejo de hablar, se los paso y sigue con la luz verde. Así que bueno, en ese contexto, exacto. Exacto. Entonces, en ese contexto, la idea es la dinámica, bueno, vamos a hacer preguntas, les voy a dar un orden, primero la palabra uno o el otro, pero que los tres puedan ir aportando un poco a estas preguntas y después dejamos un rato también para abrir al público y que nos puedan aportar. Bueno, dicho todo este contexto, un poco, ¿cuál es la visión de ustedes sobre la regulación en América Latina y los mercados y cuán adaptados cree que está esa regulación a las condiciones actuales, ¿no? Que como dijimos son diversas, pero son muy distintas a las que planteábamos en esas columnas, ¿no? De que fueron diseñados con unas condiciones que no es la realidad actual. Entonces, ¿cuál es la visión de ustedes sobre eso? ¿Y creen ustedes que la regulación genera de alguna manera las condiciones necesarias para que las inversiones puedan fluir y los incentivos estén dados para que los sectores se vayan desarrollando? Entonces, con esta pregunta bastante general, le doy la palabra primero que nada a Ramón y después vamos pasando al resto.
Lucía, gracias por la invitación y gracias sobre todo por colocar al Banco Mundial, por colocar este tema en la agenda. Hablábamos con Gabriel recién. Es un tema que realmente nos interpela porque hemos ido construyendo a lo largo de los últimos casi 30 años o más, 40 años, una estrategia regulatoria, sobre todo un modelo de mercado que estaba adaptado para las realidades que teníamos hasta este momento, que estaba muy bien, que era para esa realidad, pero tenemos una realidad completamente diferente. Y esa realidad completamente diferente a mí por lo menos me lleva a pensar y a creer, y quiero tratar de compartirlo con ustedes. Pero sobre todo lo que nos permitió fue independizarnos completamente de la variabilidad de los costos de las fuentes de los commodities energéticos y de una gran estabilidad al costo de la energía. Eso trascendió al sector eléctrico porque la matriz primaria global tiene alrededor del 65% de fuentes renovables, pero yo me quiero restringir al sector eléctrico, que creo que es el tema que estamos acá. ¿Qué pasó esto? Bueno, se dicen muchas cosas que no tienen ningún sentido, ninguna razón, simplemente por falta de información, como que esto es porque Uruguay es un país chico, porque tiene hidráulica, porque está interconectado. La realidad es muy diferente. La realidad es que esto sucedió porque Uruguay tomó un camino de un modelo de mercado que arrancó con lo que explicaba Luis, que se comenzó en Brasil en la primera década de este siglo y nosotros lo llevamos bastante más lejos. Un elemento central de esto es que en un mercado fuertemente penetrado por fuentes renovables, es decir, lo que tenemos es que la gran mayoría de la energía se despacha sin una señal de precio, porque no hay un combustible detrás de lo que se está despachando. Pasa a ser un mercado que es prácticamente un mercado de capitales, donde pasa a ser realmente el repago del CAPEX, pasa a ser el centro de la estructura de costos de ese mercado. En ese mercado, además, el precio spot está variando completamente, está por cero en muchos momentos cuando tenemos 100% renovables en el sistema, salta, y esos son señales tremendamente confusas para el mercado, pero además se genera todo el problema del missing money, es decir, que la generación térmica que la precisamos como último recurso para dar ese 1%, 2%, 3% que se precise para cerrar la generación renovable, si no con ese precio spot que va saltando todo el tiempo, muchas veces no es suficiente para repagar el CAPEX y los costos fijos de esa generación, y si se sale esa generación, se cae el sistema. Entonces, el diseño del mercado es un diseño muy diferente y se suma a otro elemento más asociado, que es que en un sistema con tanta complejidad, con tanta cantidad de actores y completamente diferente que uno tiene que gestionar la regulación, la variabilidad de la eólica y la solar, el rol de las fuentes pasa a ser completamente diferente. Y en un mercado tradicional como los que tenemos, la flexibilidad no se remunera de la forma adecuada, el seguimiento, la capacidad de seguimiento, muchas veces incluso el agua no se remunera de una forma adecuada. Entonces no está al servicio del operador del sistema tener el agua para poder hacer el seguimiento de la variabilidad de la eólica y la solar. Entonces, toda la forma que se opera el sistema y lo
the way in which we operate in the system is not adapted to the needs of the new types of systems. So it's quite complex that the roles of the different technologies are defined amongst them. So we solved this with two tools. First was moving from an short market energy market to a capacity long-term market. We talked about it, but what we used is we took 100% of the demand to long-term capacity contracts. It's a capacity system, not energy. And everything is based on capacity. If the operator of the system has availability
para poder operar a un costo óptimo el sistema. Eso fue lo que nos permitió reducir a la mitad los costos de generación de energía en el país. Pero el otro tema vinculado con esto es si vamos a tener un mercado 100% de capacidades, que eso es algo que se viene haciendo desde hace 30 años cuando uno paga la revisión adecuacy en los mercados tradicionales. ¿Cuánto de cada tecnología precisamos? Entonces ahí los modelos pasan a ser fundamentales. Los modelos y la visión sistémica para identificar cuál es la mejor complementariedad de fuentes es fundamental. Entonces el mercado compite, pero compite tecnología por tecnología. Porque se predetermina cuál es la mejor combinación de tecnologías para lograr al mismo tiempo el menor costo y la resource adequacy. Entonces ese concepto de un mercado ex ante más que un mercado diario y
exit market and the daily market with a systemic view
fue lo que terminó haciendo la diferencia para que podamos llegar a lo que llegamos. Pues me paro por aquí porque hay mucho más para hablar, pero lo que sí quiero decir es que nosotros no tenemos ningún problema con la generación distribuida, el curtailment está totalmente bajo control, porque justamente viene de una planificación sistémica, el rol de la planificación va a ser fundamental. Y último detalle, el mercado spot en Uruguay sigue existiendo, no es que se haya eliminado, sigue existiendo. Lo que pasa es que no hay ni un solo jugador en el mercado spot porque prefieren estar en el mercado de capacidades, que le brinda mucho más seguridades, atrae mucho más inversores, es un mercado de infinitamente menor riesgo, atrae otro tipo de inversores. Trajimos 6.000 millones de dólares de inversiones al país, que es el 12% del PBI del país, se crearon 50.000 puestos de trabajo. O sea, realmente el impacto se generó porque las condiciones para crear los capitales se generaron de manera adecuada.
So the impact it created was created in the right way. We could continue, but I mean.
Antes de pasar a la próxima pregunta.
Gracias. Bueno, en primer lugar, muy agradecido la invitación que me ha hecho el Banco Mundial a participar de este muy entretenido panel y además de muy interesantes presentaciones previas. A ver, la pregunta era si estamos adaptados. Yo creo que nunca vamos a estar adaptados, lamentablemente. Y ya lo planteaba el profesor Polit, que es casi una tarea imposible anticiparse y más bien, como lo señalaba, me gustó el concepto del Learning Regulators, reguladores en constante aprendizaje. Y para eso yo creo que vamos a tener que introducir herramientas que no las tenemos en todos los países, como por ejemplo los pilotos regulatorios, los sandbox regulatorios, porque efectivamente la disrupción tecnológica, el cambio en los costos de las tecnologías es totalmente dramático. Lo que hace 3 años atrás lo proyectamos para 10, 3 años después lo proyectamos para 2. Que los cambios disruptivos tanto en la demanda como en la oferta hacen que todos los modelos vayan quedando siempre atrasados. El almacenamiento no lo esperábamos de la manera como lo estamos viendo yo. Y en Chile, de no tener nada, vamos a tener al 2027 6.000 megas en almacenamiento, que es una tremenda capacidad de almacenamiento y que va a cambiar todas las proyecciones de costo marginal que teníamos de día y noche, etc. Entonces, lo
all
primero
the
que decir,
predictions
yo creo que estamos
for
frente a un
day
tsunami,
and
o es como cuando uno está en la playa,
So
esa
we are
ola
in
que
front
te
of a
revienta y te
tsunami.
da vueltas, vueltas,
It's like
vueltas.
when
Yo creo
you're
que
at the
vamos a estar
beach and you
durante
get
mucho
this
tiempo
wave
dándonos
that
vueltas
turns
en
you
esta
over.
juguera,
And I think we'll
porque las
be
disrupciones
here
realmente son
for a long
demasiado
time.
profundas, demasiado rápidas y es muy difícil
Disruptions are
adaptarse
too deep,
rápidamente
too fast,
y anticiparse.
and it's
Entonces,
really hard
de
to
esa perspectiva,
adapt and
¿cómo creo que
anticipate.
es importante
So
que
from that
podamos establecer ciertos
perspective,
principios en materia
I think
de
it's
regulación o de
important
reguladores en
that we
Latinoamérica?
can
En primer lugar,
establish some
creo que es súper
principles
importante, recojo lo que
in
decía
Latin
Ramón,
America.
tener una visión clara
I'll
hacia el norte
gather
donde
what
vamos, cuáles
Ramon
son
said,
los
to have
fundamentos
a
de
clear
la
view of the
estructura.
North where we're going with
Tenemos una
the
vocación
structure of
renovable,
our market.
nuestro fundamento va a ser
We
contratos de
have
largo
a
plazo de capacidad
renewable
y sobre esa cancha los jugadores van a poder jugar
system,
y yo voy a poder hacer
and
cambios regulatorios, pero esa
the
cancha tengo que tratarla de cambiar.
stakeholders will be able to play on that court, and we'll
Creo que
still
en ese
be able to
sentido
keep it that
comparto de
way,
que
not to make
la
changes.
formulación
So
de mercados
I
de
share
contratos
the
de largo
point
plazo,
that the formulation
a
of
mí me resulta en Chile
markets of
hace tiempo empezó una
long-term
discusión acerca de
contracts is
meter la
important.
comercialización a
Then
nivel
we
de
get
clientes
the
regulados.
discussion of
Digo,
getting the
tengamos
commercialization
cuidado
to
con eso
a
porque
regulated client
primero
level,
probablemente
and we
nos hace
should
muy
be
atractivo en términos de
careful
precio,
with that
pero vamos
because
a destruir
it will
la
not be
capacidad de tener
attractive
contratos de
in
largo plazo que vayan a buscar
pricing,
financiamiento y que
and we
vayan
will
generándose
destroy
nuevos
the capacity to
contratos. Por lo
have
tanto,
long-term
creo que es
contracts and
primero
to find
tener muy
funding.
claras esas definiciones de
So we
fundamentos
need to be
técnico-económicos
clear on that
del funcionamiento de los
definition of
mercados,
fundamentals, technical,
para dar
economic,
señales correctas a los
on the
inversionistas.
functioning of the markets to
En
keep
tercer
the
lugar,
right signs to the
me parece
investors.
que
And the third place,
creo que
I
tenemos que
think
aprovechar de la experiencia de los otros. Nosotros, en mi
we
consultora,
need to take
tenemos
advantage of
inteligencia
the
artificial, pero
experience of
claro, lo que
others.
les
We just
decimos, mira,
don't enough
la
in
gracia es que
Peru,
nosotros ya nos quemamos con la leche.
and
¿Ah?
we
Si ellos me dicen, no, pero
already
ustedes tienen
went through the
vertimiento, ustedes tienen...
experience.
Sí, 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 sí.
So, and
Ya
they say
sabemos
that we
cuáles fueron
have
las cosas buenas y las
investment,
cosas
and
malas y
yeah,
creemos que
we
podemos
know
ayudarlos
what the right
a
things and the
acompañarlos
wrong things
en el
were,
fondo cómo
and
adecuar
we
las
can
soluciones. Y
join
aquí
you
yo,
and
a propósito de
help
la
you
presentación
how
de Luis
to
Barroso, creo que
manage the
lo
situation.
que más
But
nos podemos
regarding Luis
consolidar en Europa
Barroso's
es no generar
presentation, I
esas
think we need
señales
to pay
de distorsiones
attention
que al final son
not to
imposibles de
create
sacar
this
y generan un
distorted
problema
signals that are
enorme para
impossible to
nuestros
get
mercados.
out of and
En
that
Chile
create
la generación
big
distribuida,
problems
no a
for
nivel
our
domiciliario, sino
market.
que a nivel de
In
pequeños medios de
Chile,
distribución,
our distributed generation at
tremendamente.
a
Se generó una distorsión de precios,
home
una señal de
level
precios
creates
muy
a big
repetitiva.
problem. We had a
Nosotros fuimos
distortion of
inversión
prices.
viendo esta oportunidad. Y ya tenemos unos
We got the
45.500,
investment
vamos a tener
funds looking at this
4 megas
opportunity.
solares
We
la
have
mayoría, que no
4,500.
los va a
We
incluir la
have
mayoría. Estamos en toda una discusión acerca de cuáles
mega
las condiciones
solar
nuevas que van a tener que cumplir, etcétera. Yo creo
farms, and we'll look at
para
the
el sistema
conditions they will have
le
to
genera una
meet. But for
transferencia de
the
riqueza de $300 millones
system,
anuales
it
que los pone
creates
en
a
clientes libres
transfers of riches
y
of
obligadores que tienen
300,000,
contratos regulados. Entonces,
$300 million
obviamente, si el
a
inversionista
year.
cuando ven una señal, corren porque
So when an
además
investor
hay
looks
que
at
ganar esa apuesta.
sees a signal, they
Lo
run
mismo
because they
con
need
un
to
net
win
metering
that
versus net
bet,
billing. Yo
that
digo,
position.
cuando a mí me tocó cuando era secretario ejecutivo, esa discusión
When I was
fuimos súper fuertes en decir
executive
net billing,
secretary, we had
porque
this
si no,
discussion
esto
and
no
we
se va a
had to
pagar, o
set
sea,
net
esto va a ser
billing because otherwise it's not going to be
y es muy
paid.
difícil cambiar esos
It is
entonces
going
hay
to
que tener cuidado con
be
esas malas señales, con esos
something
subsidios,
very
con los
difficult to
congelamientos de
change. So we
tarifas,
need to be
etcétera. Todas
aware
esas son
of this
señales erradas que van
because
en contra de una
those
transición
are
energética. Y por
all
último, para terminar,
wrong signals that go
creo que
into the energetic
es súper
translation.
importante
And to
que
wrap up, I think
podamos identificar bien los
it's
focos. Me
really
gustó mucho
important
que el
that we can
foco de la
identify
primera presentación
the
hablaba mucho
most
de
important
redes y de
points because in
distribución.
the first presentation we talked a lot about
Para que
networks
logremos la
and
transición energética, el problema ya no
distribution
es tanto la generación,
because in
porque nosotros
order
tenemos
to
una zona de
reach
oferta
it, the problem is not
enorme,
generation. We have
pero no tenemos red.
an
Entonces, y no
offer
tenemos red de
that's
distribución.
huge,
Una
but we don't
pequeña
have
anécdota.
networks or
Estamos todos
redistribution.
hablando de la electrificación de la
A
economía,
small
electrifiquemos,
anecdote. We're all talking
compremos
about
auto eléctrico, etc.
electrification of the economy.
En
Let's
Chile
buy
las
electric
redes de
cars.
distribución son,
Well, in Chile,
no tienen la
distribution
tecnología que
networks
deberíamos haber
are
introducido ya
really dumb, so to speak. They don't have the technology we should have introduced a while ago, but we don't have the capacity in the infrastructure. Yesterday, I talked with the manager of a company, and he said they studied that it was cost efficient for the agro industry in Chile to change from to heat pumps, and they went to the business, and they were not able to do it because they were not able to connect to their network because they didn't have the capacity. So we lose competitiveness, we lose opportunities, business opportunities, we lose the ability of taking advantage of the over-offer we have. So what's urgent right now is that we start talking about bad news. I say bad news because nobody likes transmission networks. So if we want electrification and we want transition, guys, let's put up with the towers and the technology and the new zones. And if we want electrification, well, the bill will go up a little bit. We talk about the nice things of transition, decontamination, etc. But we need to talk about the things that are related costs, and that's a very important conversation.
Thank you, Andres. You got ahead of the next question, but doesn't matter. Christian, next question, next answer? Yes. I would have to say has already been said, but I will take your context. We saw Luis explain Brazil. Colombia is smaller, but the same richness, diversity, and resources in the same network with zero marginal cost and high marginal cost resources. So here I take the comment that Andres said. Colombia arrived early to the markets in implementing a model that was unique in the books and was spread all over the world. And it was done reasonably good with markets, first with capability, then with reliability, with a plus capacity. And we've done it without looking to the side or learning from neighbors. In some things we were in front of Brazil, in others behind. At the moment, Luis was saying that distributed generation is disastrous without self-generation. In Colombia, they're thinking of including it. And they are pointing out as Brazil as a successful case, which is interesting because what's costly is hidden. You see our industrialists who say that I will be able to save the cost of the network and generators will be able to make my project viable. These things happen frequently. We have to look at a little bit more to fall into errors of others. Now, going to current challenges as seen over there, the subject of networks really ran over us. We did a contracting model for long term to bring solar and wind energy, but we never reached the moment where operations was a problem, and we don't reach it. We haven't been able to mount anything because lines were not built. And here we have the part where accepting everything that you've said from regulation, I wish to emphasize in an aspect of the institutional aspect of regulation. The model that is proposed by the bank works, and I am trained in the model and I am working it. It works if you let it. If they tell you we have to maintain clean signals, in Colombia it was achievable because we had a great scare in the 90s, a power outage, and basically the population said, they know how to do it, let them do their issues by themselves. And for 27 years, no one went into the issue or obstacleized what the regulator did. So when they made mistakes by themselves. And the planner, which followed regulators, is how we plan in Chile. And a thing that happened here is that we lost capacity of talking with the rest of the society. We felt we didn't need political validation. We felt that we didn't need to justify what we would do, and I tried to sell. And we were in Spanish. We talked in engineering language as an economist, and that ran us over. The reason for the lines not being made were social trends regarding community consultations and others. And this generated a change in balance. Today, planning a market that used to say we are going to look for expanding generation where we have minimal cost and talk of technological neutrality. Today, in the practice, who decides is the planner. When they say they were going to use a line in an area where there's a lot of solar radiation, what you will see in the future is solar power. Developing a line is easily 4 times what a plant will take that will be built along that lane. So I think in this sense, planning models have become much more important. So to conclude, and adding to what you've said, I believe that one thing where regulations hasn't achieved its maturity is it talking about with the political process outside of the power sector, the power industries. Thank you. And here there was a bit preface for the next question. So we talked at the beginning of the workshop about transmission. You are raising once again the need of thinking and discussing where generation is going to be installed and where it makes sense to find generation regarding the demands that are occurring. And Michael mentioned the subject, and you are raising it also your capacities for generation and the demands and possible solutions where transmission doesn't allow to resolve, and a bit with storage that's going to come to comply with the role. There's several countries where storage becomes a provisional solution quick to the inexistence of transmission lines of some point. So there's a buffering function. And we commented, the markets also, we don't take charge. We don't like to become liable and responsible. These designs, until what point and in which context do they work? And I think it's important to understand what are the border conditions so that these solutions can truly work. And the best things of the border conditions that exist in some countries are not transferable to the context, to the current context, or even in specific countries to having worked at some point and not work today. These border conditions require macroeconomic stability, certain technological stability, among others, and also a provision regarding having certain capacity of forecasting demand. All things that today are part of the tsunami that Andres commented. So if these things are part of this tsunami, then this model specifically is the one that has stopped being useful due to the reasons that we mentioned. So in this context, what is the role that you see for planning in Latin America in these conditions? And how do you believe it should interact with other actors, either regulator or policymakers, for the public policy entities who move these planning, and how it also involves the private sector in that role of planning per se that we've mentioned? So now, Andres, you are recognized. Yes. Yes, well, in Chile, which is an extremely free market country, when we talk of planning, people begin to become nervous, and so they begin to move their heads. But clearly, under this new schematic, this of energy transition, we need as much market as we need, but we also need planning, public planning with private participation. I like when I hear businesses say, well, tell me where we're going. With this scenario, I would adjust and invest in, etc. Which I truly believe that has to be done is this. If Chile says, look, we will go towards electrification, we're going towards a carbon neutral matrix, etc., then we're going to talk of the habilitators. We're going to talk of what does this mean. Maybe in 2050 I was talking with people from Acera. You that talk of electrification, what does it mean regarding new capacity? It's not calculated, but I've seen some uniforms that say that there's 70,000 new watts of capacity of matrix with 32,000. So where will we place them, right? Where? In this long, thin strip of land that we are. So it's quite important. We will find space, transmission, but where transmission? So clearly, if our planning models and transmission continue to place limited capacity lines, then the guitar to be needed for this won't be acceptable by anyone. So it's neither party's problem because it's not sustainable. So I think planning is key. We have to advance towards more sophisticated models. We have to advance towards models where you can have different alternatives and to be able to habilitate alternatives, to have potentialities and capacity, I think we all need methodological reset. The planners plan according to what they have done. Companies, the great power consumers, discuss expansion of the transmissions, and they don't, because they are seeing transmission prices reason, but they don't consider that in 15, 20 years with restriction to transmission, there will be problems. So that is why I believe that this planning, and I take what Luis Barroso said, will require, together with these great political social agreements, okay, we will walk towards that. So let's begin to habilitate all the regulations that allow this with methodological change, where planning transmission has enough expansion considered. This brings cost, but because if not, the conversations are like circular in this sense. I don't want this because it costs more. Yes, well, effectively it will cost more, but you will cost more here, but it will have other benefits. So it is quite essential, because if not, we will always be very tight with decoupling and lack of connection. Cristian Ramon, do you wish to add something here? Just a bit of context. After being head of regulators in Colombia, well, the pain of managing the network and expanding the network is quite present for me. And I think there are two things that we haven't mentioned. I mentioned one is the discussion periods for expansion are longer and related to construction of plants that are shorter. And this means significantly that we need to plan better, have a clear idea of where we're going in long term, and maintaining this idea sufficiently enough in time, which goes towards the public system conversation and the government issue. Another thing that has to change is, in much sense, for example, in this discussion, if marginalism have less purist markets, I haven't been friends of purism. The regulator, however, always has thought that I have to define the field. I have to place the rules. FIFA acts on football, for example. This is true. It's been true before. Independent of the model used, there are many who have worked in different sites. I believe that we're going to a more reactive world like telecommunications, where things change as quick as possible, and one can't think to have scalable rules and simply avoid experiments. And the government are thinking about trends that are not supportable for the system and break it, but do not decide to say what's on behalf of regulations. Maybe a bit more of broadened rules, and this would require also a supervisor with very good criteria, something which is an issue of our country. So at the same time, we go to a world where the planner will be who says where we're going more, and we have to begin to learn, not only with engineering, but with a reality, with the processes and community consulting, things that usually are seen in the power sector and very important, where we can truly see where the system will be going. And it's more important for investors, and a regulator that a little bit more beside the river and see what happens at river level and are able to control. But the rest is experimentation. I believe that's where we're going towards. So this is an important rebalancing, and it talks a bit about something that I didn't talk about in Colombia, and is that many talk of independence of the regulator, but none of the independence of the planner. And I think this is an important difference. To talk of planning for me is all in the context that we are in today, specifically. And here I want to be emphatic. For me, planning is not contrary to market. On the contrary, one can do market with planning and without planning. What I do wish to say clearly for all is that planning, indicative planning, is the same as the lack of planning. If not just to give more information on the market, but if you want to know where Brazil has to place their lines and identify the combination between land use for energy or other use, what we need is a linking and bonding planning to determine among all variables what is the best distribution of investments. Linking planning is not contrary to market, and we talked of this in Uruguay, and investors were happy about it. It came to such low rates of investors that the capital cost was so low that what was built was low, of the lowest that we have seen, with capacity factors were at quite mid-level for Uruguay. And this is because planning and defining where the private sector competes is the panacea. It's the miracle. We have to talk of many variables with always partial information of the market actors. So what can be said? Well, planning makes mistakes, of course. Planning will always make mistakes because it's humans who, it's not the models that make mistakes, it's the humans when we talk of the hypotheses where we will talk of planning, of course. But we've done this for decades now when we define when we talk of equus resource, how much contracts we need, we are placing hands. And this is under this hypothesis and under this probability of fail, we accept that the system can work. This is the same. It's the best for the investor, thus with low rates of capital cost. When it's only capital cost of renewable energy markets, it's better for the demand because there's less capital cost to satisfy its needs. So planning becomes crucial. And this is not contradictory to the market. On the contrary, according to the experience, this is the miracle drug. Thank you to the three of you. Or I'll go longer then. We've written it down as the first question for Medardo in the row. So we have 3 questions in order to the best bidder. The 4th question goes 1, 2, and 3 then. The 3rd question then is from an actor, which you said, well, Luis didn't mention. And it's what happens with, I come from Argentina, as you've realized, and the distribution sector is a sector that gives Argentinians chills, those who understand the sector. We have many things, companies, distributors, and it's all difficult for distribution. That's the better, Mike, yes? And while Luis mentioned a bit better about distributed generation, and we have to change the system a bit, and we understand that about other things, there's the fiscal cost, what it involves, and this has an impact. Yes? It's me then. So, here a bit more, the 3rd question for you all would be, what is happening with the distribution segment in Latin America? The case may be a bit extreme, but as I've said in the beginning, Latin America is varied. We have countries that have one distributor company or not, called UTEN in Uruguay, or ANDE in Paraguay. We have Colombia with a pair of UPM that had an example of utility for many, and we have Argentina with 35 large companies and other 600 or so around. And any of these may imply that distributors do not have capacity to assure service, basically, because if there are issues in distributed generation, many of them would die out, right? So the question is, one thinks of regulation and you think of distribution. What is your view from the service provider's point of view, and how you think all of this is affecting positively or negatively? You don't have, or it doesn't have to be homogeneous. What do you think should be the future steps? And let us offer the word. Colombia is at the moment starting to change its regulatory framework for distribution, and it's in the middle of a crisis of somewhat 20% of Colombian distribution is almost going broke, since they are in hand of private countries with issues, of companies with issues. When you talk of transmission, you are clear. It's the large network, and here we have the plan without a doubt. When you talk of generation, well, these are the markets, and these are markets in competition perfectly. These are market competitive entities, and we know how they behave. Distribution is halfway of the conflict. First, they have to work with you. There's no thing more difficult than having to face the public. In Colombia, formally, it's not the distributor who faces the public, but the commercializer. The distributors have commercializers, because facing people is the worst of the world. And now we not only have to face people as consumers, but also as distributed generators that even place a rooftop or a limit, and as Luis said, a demand that stopped being understandable and at one moment began to have oscillations and sometimes would give power to the network. They are broadening both sides of discussion. We have an idea clear of what to do with markets, and probably we will have to change, but we know how to think of markets and planning of a large network that will probably have to be changed, but we will know how to think about that, and distribution is the limbo. Here we have to add a political issue, and a bit review of that idea is to talk about taxing the sun. There was a version of this, and why should we charge for that? So there are financial issues to consider. And what does this mean? What we've talked of flexibility to facilitate life so that it solves issues as a sense, and in sense of generation, that's inside I wish to leave a note. Specifically, if we have to give flexibility of how it administers its issues, it's distributed. Because I imagine a smaller country that has a smaller network, it's easier to think of this distributor is almost like to think of that naturally. Colombia has 30 among different populations, and here we have to leave a little bit and to generate incentives so that investments can say that we need to move in this moment, and we can. So there's a place that I wish to leave both regulatory aspects, and it's where distribution should administrate its own business, and it's here where we will be almost like the Cinderella of the ball. We are there, not yet. We are not that yet. Clearly, we are not yet there. His microphone is off. Yes, I am almost like a homeowner. Yes, we would have to go, right? He needs to speak into the mic, please. We can't hear. So, in your last intervention, as Colombia said, and they say that models are not wrong. At least I understand that. It's the data put into the models. And this also means a risk because you are assuming that all models have the capacity of incorporating all of the new variables that come into play. So the concern and the question that I won't be able to hear the answer of, but it's important that those who will, what happens with the models and what has to be done with the models that historically we've used. I was planner, and which are the models that we use in Latin America, and in which measure there's an obligation of evolving and developing with these tools, that if we talk of bonding planning, it will constitute into a fundamental element for the development of the full infrastructure. So we apologize, but I have to go to the meeting. I leave the question proposed, but I have to leave. And Eduardo asked the question most important and knows the answer, but it's relevant that we talk about. And let us save on distribution. Two things. First, in this context, in this global context that we have, and probably it's true as small countries have sole networks which have sole buyers, which means a significant element of pool of buyers which begin to have an issue. But I wish to refer to the concern and generation on distributed generation. I wish to be here disruptive. For me, distributed generation, if I go strictly to a subject purely economic, it's suboptimal. It's clearly suboptimal. We know that there's empowering, democratization, its pros and negatives and possibilities in society, but we have to talk of the discussion out of context. But The problem is the rooftop for me is how a signal is not offering answers to the people, because it's more expensive to install a photovoltaic panel on the roof of your house than install the same kilowatts level of utility. It's always, and it's double. So if people go to this, it's because the network is not offering solution. And additionally, and the system becomes optimal and clear. And it's not that it reduces network use, because there has to be availability likewise, because its maximum could have 30 or 40% of the time in generation itself, but 60% you have to look for it in a network. And even worse, we have available infrastructure, but it's not used majority of time. So it's suboptimal. And from a social point of view, only people who have capability to invest have capability of resolving their issues. In other words, it's a problem that this is happening. It's because power systems are not giving the solutions to the people. And this is happening. So for me, what we have to focus upon is in giving and to transform our systems so that people doesn't have to recur to solutions that generate negative impacts for economy.
They're doing it indefinitely for the system that is not optimal. I think this is one of the key subjects we need to talk about in the region, here in Chile, in the whole region, and it's urgent. I want to talk about 3 dimensions. First, institutional, because going from administrating the hardware and then going to be an operator and have visibility of the whole network and managing offer and demand. And when we get rain and we have an interruption of the supply, we don't have a whole city on a power outage, which is what happens in our country, where unfortunately with the first rain, we need to change the system. We need to change the distribution system. We need to look at the incentive model related to the outputs generated by the distribution that has the incentives to change, innovate, and go beyond infrastructure. And there are models developed like that in the world that can create solutions of generation, distribution, storage. I coincide that with Ramon, with this work they did in MIT of the future. It's crazy that people will start putting photovoltaic panels in an organic way because they will have an inefficient network that's more expensive, and the distribution system should say it's convenient to place panels over here and storage here. Therefore, I can save on this other investment. I think that's a kind of regulation by incentive that are key to take over. Can you hear me? Yeah. And the third element that I think is key, because in general, and unfortunately, as Christian said, sometimes in the sector we focus more on infrastructure and generation and not the people who are receiving the electric system. And of course, we have to move forward to a tariff change, because paying 24/7 at 3 p.m. the same tariff as at 2 a.m. 2 a.m. is cheaper in Uruguay. But that's really interesting, because we need to go from having a network that has the capacity to measure the people time like every hour. We need to go to a smart chart. And I will tell you the experience we're having to be creating a change in the and we have different blocks. In 2015, we introduced that, but we made a mistake in the decision I say we because I'm the executive secretary who made the decision. There was a context over there, of course, that we had the standard in block, but the algorithm created the best combination for 24 hours or 5 blocks. And in general, they were 24/7. So today, the constitution of the average price of the regulated contract in Chile is 24/7. Even though it's 7 blocks today, I cannot generate except in some adjustments that we can make. There's except some adjustment we can make. We in 10 years when we have the block, we could have started creating a different way that reflected costs. They have this 24/7 system. And they want to make it hour by hour because they can be installed there, but beyond our reasonable interest. We should look at what's the most efficient tariff for the final user. Cost tariff or a 24/7. What has the best price? Because I'm not getting any signal. So I suppose 3 elements are key talking about distribution. Because it's paradoxical that we're going to have huge energetic transition. We have panels towards the north and the south. And the only thing that has happened is that we have power outages after the first rain and electricity is more expensive. So it doesn't make sense for the end consumer. It will make sense when we have the capability to adjust our demand. And when we realize that the sun is cheaper, but so far it is not. Can you hear me? I want to say something different. Because you agree on something I think is not correct. The 24/7 tariff, regular tariff in Colombia is different the time with a very small of managing it. I think it's okay when I think as an engineer, because I started as an engineer, then I went to an economist. People install on their roads. It's not efficient, and the system should make sure they don't want to do that. Cool. I assume that people do not accept because people do exist. The distributor pays as a share. If the planification doesn't work, I have no idea what's going on, and I would not find out by my monitoring this. If I want to have feedback from the public, I need to do it right. There's 2 things. They burn the street if it doesn't work. It has happened everywhere. And actually does. Or I make sure for people to be able to access. Ross voice is to go to the street. Exit is to be able to go to the street. So I need to make sure that when there's not a good distribution system, that people have an out. So I need feedback. I need the possibility for people to do this exactly. So they create the pressure for the distributor to do this. Does the regulator or the plan don't have enough information to make sure that the system is working properly or so. Ideally, I don't want to have this kind of distributed information, but ideally, I need to have the regulatory environment to be able to have the distributed generation that can help the user. Because I cannot be helping the access for the user. I totally agree, but there's a fact that if we have this problem, the next question was what happens with the last link. be annoying because the teachers have the parents of the students, but the distributors have the users. So that's our question. How does it reach the consumers? So we covered this because I have 4 people in line for more questions. I think we will move on to the audience. So the first question is being answered, and that's number 2. Hello, it's a pleasure to meet you. Thank you for your words. Your insights have been great. David videos are represent open children fish. We're an organization that's looking to transition energetically with planning open source. And we have had the experience and the opportunity to watch how in Europe and other places in the world we are adopting not just a new generation of farming, to open source model. I mentioned some examples of Sorry, which is this organization in Europe, or even the regulators in Canada. They have started open source methods with types that were compiled and it's a new movement and it's a new way to want to do this more transparent, more social. What's your take on this movement and way of planning in the region? I have a question here, and Marcelo and Esteban will move on to the second answer. Hello, thank you for the opportunity. My name is Daniela, study physics. I'm just moving into the sustainability world. And my question, maybe it's not urgent, but it's still important, taking advantage of the opportunity of energetic transition that can involve new changes. Because in the world we have limited resources for our lack of it. We are running out of oil and we come to other kinds of energy. So how we reach these technologies that have shelf life, considering what we have learned from oil, so we don't run resources that didn't use them. And on the other hand, is it possible to get and define economic growth, maybe not in this generation, but in a few more, we will have a plateau. And I think it's important to propose frameworks for this transition in order to face the lack of resources that maybe we will get to a point without energy and an economy that cannot grow indefinitely because resources are not indefinite. Thank you. I'll take the first two. Yeah, I will begin. 2 from Fred and yours related to planning. When you give focus to planning, the model becomes the most important thing. And way you talk to all the stakeholders in order to create this plan. We have to have an open source model. Otherwise, it doesn't work because all of the parties will have questions for the so all of them should be able to verify that the results are the same. What other things could happen? Yeah, the perfect time from the University of Berlin organized several organizations that are using it. So it's a classic example. Second, it's important as a model, how it is the hypothesis which we're going to run the model. And that's where we actually look at the game. We'll have to have a discussion with the leaders or planners, no one authorized by law to make that definition. Third, question, understanding model of what we're used to having right now. It has to have a model that optimizes but guarantees that the problem can be overcome it has to be a model that can simulate the scale from the second to see what happens with the stability and frequency secondary mechanisms have the time to act. It has to be able to simulate the scale of the minute, to be able to see the ramp, has to be able to simulate the scale of the time to see what happens locally with the energy, the scale of day, see what happens with fuel, mass, or management. So it has to be a real flight simulator. But it is still worth it. It has to guarantee that it's optimal, the ultimate system. And sometimes we need to have more road skipper returns or some reform more containment, but that's what the percentage in order to have cheap energy, so we don't like energy to work. So it has to be all perfect. So in case we develop a model that's called CNSA, that's for being taken used in several cases to work with the operators of systems of the world in several countries. I want to understand it to have this flight simulator, but if it's not something that using a planning model that is dangerous. And fundamentally, the person in charge of the operator in order to say this, what you're modeling is operable. Otherwise, it's impossible. 30 seconds to answer your question. I convinced that the donut theory, there is minimal growth that we need, but beyond that, that we integrate and the whole thing is related to the manufacture, recycling, economy. This is the raw materials that will cover eolic parks or solar parks. Actually, use once as raw materials when still have a cool raw material for the plant, but throughout the shelf life, all the generations use raw material, but how do we recycle it afterwards in order not to throw it away and have a circular economy? First, regarding planning, I think each space has particularities in compliance with certain conditions. We have a transmitter, a company in charge of operation. Planification is the most adequate. I believe more that the market has to provide those solutions that are more efficient and will have risks that are related to the development of generation. Of course, if I build land in that way, I have to provide signal. But in that case, I think in this market we have not done forward. So we need to look at the market how to do it. Just looking at it all day, we should have open source code. We have to Chile, but this model is a model because we don't know how much is going to be wind, the variability of the wind, what's going to happen in the clouds. So as much as we model uncertainty always has last word. It's a reflection beyond if there is a limit to grow or not. We're working on reducing infrastructures, how to take advantage of the carbon mining in the future. So we are thinking about that. A reflection that we haven't touched here in the panel, because we do have conditions in Colombia that Chile wants to work in the regional integration, thinking when you also have the drought that a few years ago being serious problem. And I remember back in that time, because I was an E, we were told, hey, the connection and stop with Argentina and which not possible. Probably if we want to be completely electric in Chile, we will always install the energy from Argentina or Brazil, then we will create commercial instruments and financial instruments to supply. Colombia has that switch broad will be the corridor. That's a big subject because I would not tell the World Bank because they have always been involved. But I think we need to look more drastic problem. And people look at these contracts in order to look at their market.
When they talk of the model, I know they're talking of a computer, but I imagine it larger. And I will move into two different directions. The first is how do you clearly know what you need, and a model is more granular and all the horizons necessary for planning. But this is clear, but this is risky to believe that since the model gives detailed information, you have more information towards the future. And unavoidably, as the time variable advances, you have more uncertainty. And independent of what the model says, probably it isn't. It isn't a characteristic of the model. It is of 40,000 things that are not modeled and will be important. So here's important where things become more broader. You have to be aware of the limitations of your model. Discussion is not of what the model says, but of to where do I believe it. And the model is not just the sense of a model that is being proposed. It's an organizational model of how to discuss planning. Whom do I ask? Or until where do I believe? It is a decision where different layers participate. Those whom are agents of the sector, and in a certain sense, people more in the political world. And in a broader sense, I have to try to see what the general audience would do at around 15 years in the future. So the model is not only the model of the system, it is a broader model of how planning is done in general. That is just an observation. It also calls what you mentioned. Someone said that someone here said in the audience, if you wish to have a planner that plans everything to the bottom, one needs emergently to reduce the complexity of the planning exercise. And if you have a sufficiently large system, you have to decentralize planning. So we have to start up top, we plan transmission, we define interfaces with distributor, and from there on below, but we have to plan. Even though the model has the capabilities, and decentralization is optimal when it's extremely complex and large. And this brought me to bring down into the question that was made. And the question made is there's no finite time answer. And I'm just further than what I agree with you said. We've learned how to do sustainable things, and we find new variables where we have to place sustainability because we end up stopping a variable. And the reality of the case is that we will die in finite time, and this discussion will have to be resolved by other generations. And I am not convinced that the lessons of these type are well transmitted through generations. So even though the conversation is going to be resetted, and we will all have to cover against. In general public policy, the sectors never is resolved. It is administered, managed. It is brought down to a level to be managed, but it will grow again, and we'll have new people come along. So these are the issues. Issues are not solved, but pushed forward to be able, and procedures are just domesticating it for a short time. So maybe the only thing that I think is transcendent among generations is something that we've seen with answering to the demand, and it's to create people habits, indoctrinate them so that it becomes something that culturally stays. But apart from this, plan further than a generation is to build castles in the air. We have several questions. Ramon wants to comment, yes, but I think everyone wishes to intervene. For me, this is the most interesting moment of the afternoon. where this debate, which is expectable when we talk about making a model that's going to be bonding, everyone begins to tremble and begin to talk out loud. Of course, models that we have is a stochastic model that includes all of the possible climate scenario, power scenarios, each with its probability of occurrence. We run thousands of different scenarios before choosing on optimal with variance and median. And with this, a regulator would say to what is the maximum amount allowable risk. And then at one moment where the price of oil rose, so this is modeled with probability of occurrence. If not, it is useless. If not, it's just empty data. So I think something that's very difficult to accept here, but truly which I wish to transmit is that we are going to go to a system dominated by complementation of different technologies where the cost of capital is most important, so that it doesn't happen what happens in Chile, where the signal price signals, where everyone went to photovoltaic or we had to quickly make lines or install batteries, is not optimal because it was not planned and the market did not have enough information to make decisions of this level of complexity of transformation. That is why I hope to have more time to express the relevance that planning has, very good planning may have for the future. Marcelo. Most of the content, I am Argentinian. We talk everything through soccer, and I remember a coach who says that I plan a game, the referee plays his whistle, the rival moves, and planning is useless. Which I want to say as a specific comment is that the power system and electrical system in general has its reason to be due to the service that it offers. Humans cannot be part of the electrical system. We aren't a collateral effect of the system, and that is why the system was created in the first place. And second is that we are quicker than ever regarding decarbonization, but slower than that we should. And the power system has to transform by externality, internalizing externalities, which is decarbonization. None of us know, we are in unknown terrains, trying to plan it all. As Ramon says, we never are able to consider all variables. What I believe is that two comments regarding distributed generation, and I will shut up. Regarding distributed generation, I do not remember with the system, if it were optimal, distributed generation would not exist, because it has to do with the conception of the value of kilowatt hour due to the price of technology and cost of generation. And in the employer and citizen empowerment and change of system justifies distributed generation. That's first. And second, I wouldn't take as unsuccessful cases of Brazil or PMGD. These are initiatives without due planning that had really good results with still resolvable issues. But I wouldn't consider the generation of employment or development of SMEs, the impact of regional economies, or the balance. There are many, many benefits that contrast evident issues of not having correct planning. And I will shut up because I think we finished, right? Esteban. Well, I will avoid the small talk and the appreciations, but it was an excellent panel. I wish to comment on something you said regarding distributed generation as a leakage or exit point, defending a consumer when distributors do not comply their task well, if I understand that point well. And it seems to me a bit problematic as a concept, because if distributed generation truly works as a mechanism, I am not completely sure that it will never give a economic cost benefit, but I believe that the ideality of using scale is more efficient. But now when you have large scale transmission, or when the cost of land in the south is very costly, maybe there is sense to decrease cost to infrastructure. There may be margins there, but to consider it as a leak point for the consumer, when you give a solution to consumers, where Luis Barroso said, and you have said, where there's a scheme where it is quite unequal regarding whom has a capacity to exit the distribution. And then it shouldn't be, they don't stop being companies that are regulated, or a regulator occupy itself by complying its function. So to tell the user, those who can leave and those who stay pay triple of a very bad service because it's what exists. So it's a conceptual issue that at least made a lot of noise for me. A bit about the risks mentioned before. Thank you. I am Freddy Pocar from Peru. Well, first to congratulate the three panelists. Stupendous high-level presentations. This highlights the activity where we are at, and we learn greatly from you. To comment that in Peru, recently, we have published a norm that will regulate distributed generation, and we have started a project through Net Willing. So my question is that, do you think that Net Willing has complied its purpose in strengthening self-consumption without generating distortion in the market? Or what do you think variables should be considered so that this is viable? And my second question is, what regulatory incentives are needed so that distributed generation supports demand management and not just a scheme of accidents injection into the market? Thank you very much. Surplus injection into the market. Thank you. I am Pablo Caras from Vector Renewables. More than a question, I wish to reflect. On this panel, we've heard words that have been repeated, and one of them is market, planning, and model. And on this, there are many things to say, specifically when it is created by humans logically, and it's most dangerous when there are engineers behind, and I am one of them, because what we maintain is a great fear of not having a planned theme or what will occur or what is to occur. For this, we answer with our models. And what the problem is a model is the simplification of reality. So we believe that we do a better model because we make more variables. In my employment and in my career, I was hired for price moving, and the only thing I've seen is that the price curve that they give me will not happen. So our plans and our decisions are based on those models that we know that will fail, but at least work for some time, but then we will have to adapt because it's dynamics. So I just wish to say, what is the answer to this? Maybe we are underestimating what the market can truly do, that it will react quicker and is capable of listening with higher reactivity and speed to clients, and to deliver a framework that is necessary so that it is the market to tell us what the planning is to be, or what are the models under which we want to simplify our realities with. Just that. We're going to make an exception. I would just like to say something short. I am also from Uruguay. I work at UTE, the power company, in planning. Well, the models that we have are quite good. They are reliable. There's the human factor which the model uses and introduces its hypotheses. This is fundamental. In Uruguay, as Ramon mentioned, we have a strong influence on hydroelectric generation. So when we use models, we simulate in different hydrological scenarios. High precipitation, low precipitation. Sometimes we have expansion issues of the system, which what amount of wind power has to enter with competitive pricing to solar and other technologies. So the system expanded, and in a year with high rains, well, you would say, well, wind is a surplus. Well, with the Monday's paper, people would say how bad planning there was. But in 2022, we had a great drought, which affected drinkable water supply. And in Uruguay, with the power system, which was have high reliability, in other case, millions of dollars would have been spent. So that's the issue with the Monday newspaper. It's easy to criticize or take a posture, but to plan, that's it. To expect the value for have the most reliable and optimal system in economical terms, but no one knows what truly will happen. We have to balance that out and comment with full knowledge and discussion. Thank you for the comments. Well, let us review because you are a bit busy. Marcelo made his question regarding in favor of the distribution, and here we have Esteban who was not convinced of the loss, and here we're opening just possibilities to a market segment. We have Freddie who made specific questions for the Peruvian case, 2 specific questions. We have Pablo who did a pro-market apology, the most efficient sector, and we have Magdalena from UTE who talked from a point of view of planning and how this can be truly done. So, and the Monday newspaper with planning. So the floor is yours.
Bueno, entonces empiezo.
So I will start here. I completely agree. And there's an important factor of user empowerment. And it's what gives us legitimacy. In the next years, decades, we will ask for costs and sacrifices to users. It's better that we have legitimacy because if not, they will burn us. Legitimacy is an important asset and empowering is an important element. I agree. The work is to avoid income where some people generate more benefits than others, and others become proprietors of a network. It's more important than the time scheduling. It's not to use ingredients to have everyone pay for the network, but we have to avoid these for the same reason. We wish to have political legitimacy, and we want people to know. Well, models versus market. Let us say, market, their main risk that they have not only among ourselves, but among the general audience is that they generate illusions of something that we don't know about. And market is incidentally a political apparatus. Also, reality checks. When one begins to say that on paper, it doesn't look well, and in the model, it doesn't look well, reality, it doesn't look well, and the market will tell you. So you have to use them as what they are. It's the accounts. Well, the audience is the goal, right? They will feed back and talk back. On the net billing in Colombia issues, we don't have enough to know if it was successful or not. And the final comment, I had to, before the power sector, I worked in tax authority. Tax authorities, their work is, apart from the power sector, is to distribute pain. If someone is smiling, they have done a bad work. Everyone has to have a sad face there. One days one materializes, others you're burned at the stake, others you are not. So this will generate resistance. I read it in the paper every day. I review last month's summaries of news, and there's nothing around this issue. It's the nature of public policy and decision making and making mistakes, because sometimes you make mistakes and one is at fault, but it's the nature of the exercise, and we have to get used to spreading pain, and we won't stop making people crazy at the end. Well, because I think the most important subject that we have today, I will talk of planning. I think this is a central issue because I believe, thank you, yes, 2 minutes, okay, that there continue to be a false opposition between planning and market. There's a false opposition. One thing is a market, an ex-ante market, another is a daily market. One isn't less than the other. In fact, 30 years ago, that current markets do resource adequacy and we hire. These are models. How much does Colombia need for its, or Texas, unless Texas or Australia or other parts of the world, we have these models. But additionally, all operators work under model functioning. They have models to tell them when there's water, what is the proportion of cost opportunity of water, and when it's worth dispatching thermals. So models form part of the electrical systems. We use models to make ex-ante contract designation. So we have the offers of different sources come along at different prices defined by market, an offer and demand, and thus prices are moved. And these prices, how much is good here, how much is good there, but it's finally resolved politically. But each one of the technologies are added into the model to see what would be the operational optimum for the next 20 years. You're simulating operation for the next 20 years. So they are models just like those used in the beginning, the same model that we optimize systems and Uruguay. They are models that are useful at the moment and designate that ex-ante market and define how much you need for and how much technology under the function of pricing of market it gets. But it is a completely different model concept, and these include with probability of occurrence the different scenarios that you wish to consider with the probability of occurrence of what you wished to happen. So I would like to continue discussing this, but I want to leave just a seed there that it's good. Maybe the conceptual aspect has to be looked at to say that models are a problem. They are also a problem. We have no other way for such a complex system as electrical system to be managed without models. We don't have other things. And I just want to say this. It's impossible to manage the intermittence or variability of sources, which is a technological issue. Human engineering placed a man on the moon 56 years ago, but they can't manage correctly an electrical system. This is just the dominant argument that we have to continue along the same line. We will continue with a system that has a very strong bias towards continuity of fossil fuels because it was designed for fossil fuels. If we don't think out of the box, we won't reach net zero ever.
We will have a medical seminar. We will invite you to one. I don't know how we'll benefit the audience, though. I think it's important. Yeah, we agreed on that. I think if it's a point that's really important to talk about, it's hard to say what's the best model. I want to specify something. We could have a market model where the market for the solution and say the problem we have here is that we're over the offer, so we have a marginal cost of 0. And I can say that this is a private business for stop that concern. Well, it's a private risk that's not going to pay for the final consumer, and they that have this regulated concept that have a average price. Which surprised the other day, for example, is we complain a lot. We said we have one of the most expensive electric bills. I'm surprised to say that in Uruguay it was expensive. I'm surprised because I thought it was impossible. There's no audio for it. But yeah, I think now from the last thing you said, I think that the station method of offer instead of saying I want to know here, another one there. I think it's smarter than offer. But it's really interesting with this system that change constantly, require integration and the role of planning to design systems, infrastructure, mission become cheap. And today, those models don't have those capacities. Regarding net billing, I would say that in our head, we think we have an incentive model. Why? Is there a reason with it? It's when you create public policy, you say, is there a problem that requires this? Then so I would say that do, they don't require to incentive distributed generation now. So different would be for the regulation to give you the possibility to do this for a business or a purpose you want to develop. And basically, you these are your price then you're connected. And that is not an incentive, that's just giving the possibility to work on. And I think net benefit is that, and you can provide energy as a regulated user, plus or less the amount of loss factor you could say. I think that has worked well because it has been incorporated progressively and slowly, but in reasonable levels. And I would say it's not incentive. Actually, I would say it's crazy if we had more incentive solar panels because we would have to bring people to consume the energy that's going to be produced. That has been a model, and regarding the rest, I agree with my colleague. Thank you very much. Well, thank you, all three of you. A big round of applause for you also.
Al público por la participación.
To the
Así que bueno,
audience
muchas gracias
for
a todos por
their participation. So thank you very much for the questions. Gabriela, 3 minutes to close. And a picture that we.
Bueno, colegas, estamos 15 minutos arriba de la hora, pero fue por una buena razón. Y yo creo que la buena razón es que este taller, estas sesiones fueron intensas, súper.
And really interesting. I would like to thank our participants, Professor Michael Pauling, Roger Watt to lead by Professor Mero Ramon and Jaramillo, important questions that positively summarize. I was trying to take the most important points, but people have to figure that out. I'm really surprised because no one talks about artificial intelligence and giving us that we have today. That's not the machine learning, artificial intelligence limitations. Maybe that will help us in the future to solve those complex subjects. Thank you, Michael, for utilizing that. That are so important. I wish we could write a book about the challenges we're facing and the solutions that we are coming up with. That's why we have this group of experts. And I mean, you said we shouldn't reset the conversation. New generation shouldn't reset the conversation. They should understand what we're going through. So the next generation with machine learning and artificial intelligence can create the next generation of planning, regulation, and operation of electric system. And I will stop here. Thanks for participating. Have a great afternoon and a good week. Thank you very much.